In the glass tower room, billionaire Richard Halden shouted, his voice trembling, "If no one translates, this whole deal is doomed." Officer Briggs jerked his chin and spat. "Ask that janitor girl. Maybe she's fluent in toilet scrubbing." Mocking laughter echoed like a flock of vultures tearing into someone who stood frozen. Miriam Cole gripped her cleaning rag tightly, eyes blazing, then suddenly snapped back. "You want a translation? Listen carefully." A burst of Mandarin erupted, sharp, icy, like blades slicing through air. The entire room froze. Those who had sneered were left gaping, as if they'd swallowed steel thorns. In that moment, the fake power of money and guns was ripped apart, exposing the truth. It is knowledge and dignity that command the world's silence. Watch until the end, and witness the scorned one become the center of gravity, leaving both the CEO and the police speechless, stripped of everything, in disgrace. The magnificent glass building stood in the heart of the city, glowing under the midday sun, its windows reflecting the blue sky and the stream of traffic below, as if to affirm the power of this place. On the top floor, CEO Richard Halden waited inside a luxurious meeting room, where warm lighting mixed with glass walls created an atmosphere both lavish and stifling. Today was no ordinary day, as he had called for an important meeting with a delegation of Chinese business people, hoping to close a multi-billion-dollar deal that could expand his empire into the Asian market. Assistants moved urgently, folders trembling in their hands as if drawn into the tension radiating from the powerful man. Richard paced around the long table, stroking his wrist, eyes scanning the room as if to ensure every detail was perfectly in place. Footsteps pounded toward the room, and the door swung open. Mr. Zhang and the Chinese delegation entered, nodding politely, their expressions cold and stern. One of them spoke quickly in Mandarin, his voice sharp, his eyes fixed on Richard with probing intent. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for the CEO's response. But in that instant, it was as if the sound had been sucked from the space. The translator who had been promised was nowhere in sight. The chair next to Richard sat empty, like a sudden void opening up amid the opulence. Mr. Zhang tilted his head and repeated the question in his native tongue, this time with more urgency and edge. Richard flinched, fingers tightening, his face turning pale. He cleared his throat, lips trembling, and stammered a few broken words in English. "Where's my translator?" The question echoed across the vast room, bouncing off every glass wall, turning his anxiety into a public display of shame. The business people exchanged looks, dissatisfied, whispering in Mandarin. Richard blinked rapidly, sweat trailing down his temple, hand tugging at his collar as if it were choking the air from his lungs. The staff behind him lowered their heads, avoiding his gaze, while a few bit their lips to suppress mocking smile. Faint chuckles rose from a distant corner where security staff and assistants stood watching. The once sophisticated atmosphere turned into a stage of embarrassment. The expensive watches on Richard's wrist, the glass trophies on the shelf, all became meaningless in the face of the language gap spreading like a trap. In the corner of the room, Miriam Cole quietly continued her work. Her hand gripped a damp cleaning cloth, each circular motion on the glossy tabletop catching sharp reflections from outside. Every movement was patient and precise, a habit etched deep by years of repetition. She said nothing, made no interruption, knowing her place in this room was that of an invisible presence. All eyes were fixed on the CEO and the international guests. No one spared a glance at the woman in the simple janitor's uniform. In moments like these, Miriam was often treated as part of the furniture, existing but unnoticed. The soft friction of her cloth against the table blended with the ticking of the clock, quietly at odds with Richard's short, panicked breath. Richard now looked cornered. He forced a stiff smile and gestured for the business delegation to sit down, hoping to buy some time. But Mr. Zhang quickly exchanged words with his colleague, his tone growing even more urgent. Another man from the group abruptly placed a stack of documents on the table, the rapid Chinese speech slicing through the heavy air like arrows, making Richard's helplessness all the more visible. He slid back slightly in his chair, muttering nonsense under his breath, his hands clasped tightly, veins bulging. In his mind, every plan, every promise tied to the contract, was falling apart like scraps of paper. The assistants tried frantically to make phone calls, but the signal was weak and the translator couldn't arrive immediately. A young staffer attempted to open an auto-translation app, but Richard glared and hissed, "Shut it down!" His anger, mixed with despair, made him appear threatening, but to the international guests, it only further exposed his lack of professionalism and arrogance. Chairs shifted slightly as a few members of the Chinese delegation stood and whispered to one another, a clear sign they might leave at any moment. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry, eyes bloodshot from stress. Miriam glanced up briefly, her gaze catching the CEO's reflection on the polished table she had just cleaned. A wealthy, powerful man, now trembling before silence. In that moment, she felt the class divide wasn't just in black suits or yellow rag, but in how society chooses to assign human worth. Still, she stayed quiet, continuing her slow, deliberate motions across the glass, knowing it wasn't yet her time to be seen. Richard clenched the pen on the table and slammed it down with a sharp crack, trying to reclaim control. "We need the translator right now, or this deal is over," he barked, but no one responded. Only the soft murmurs in Mandarin echoed back. Foreign waited, making him feel like a man lost in a world not his own. The billions swirling in his head suddenly felt like unreachable luxuries, as a seemingly small language barrier turned him into a powerless fool before his partners. Miriam stopped, set the cloth down, and drew in a deep breath. She still didn't speak, but her clear eyes reflected the blazing light above, like a quiet fire waiting to ignite. The room was now both opulent and chaotic, both silent and loud, as if bracing for an explosion that would shatter everything. And every gaze, though not yet direct, would soon have no choice but to turn to the last place anyone expected. The luxurious meeting room remained bathed in light from the massive glass wall, but the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers began among the rows of employees, at first cautious, then growing clearer. One person murmured, just loud enough for the whole row to hear, "He's that rich and still couldn't get a translator." The words spread like sparks in dry straw, igniting smirks and muffled snickers. Some turned away to hide it, but their eyes glinted with quiet satisfaction. The admiration once directed at Richard Halden had quickly turned into a silent mockery, because everyone understood that forgetting a translator in a meeting like this was an unforgivable mistake. Richard heard it. Veins bulged on his neck. He was used to applause, to nods of approval and flattery, and now he was being mocked by his own staff. His pride surged violently. He slammed his hand on the table and cursed. "Shut up! All of you! Shut the hell up!" The shout rang out, sharp and jarring, but only made his embarrassment more obvious. Instead of restoring authority, Richard revealed his stress and helplessness. A few members of the Chinese delegation gave him puzzled looks, while a nearby assistant stepped back, afraid the outburst might drag them down with it. The air thickened by the minute, with sighs and soft taps of pens on glass, reminding everyone that time was slipping away and the billion-dollar deal was fading from reach. In another corner, Officer Briggs, the man in charge of security, leaned casually against the wall. He had never taken Miriam Cole seriously, the quiet black janitor always working with her cleaning cloth. Briggs smirked, his eyes filled with disdain. When he saw Miriam pause briefly, her gaze drifting toward the meeting table, he seized the chance to humiliate. He jerked his chin and said lazily, cutting through the tension, "Hurry it up. This ain't your place to eavesdrop." His words sliced through the room, cruel and crude. A few staff looked up, some chuckled, others stayed silent, but their eyes betrayed quiet agreement. Miriam froze in place, her hand still clutching the rag darkened by years of scrubbing. Briggs's words stabbed deep, though it wasn't the first time. Over the years, mocking comments and belittling looks had become part of her daily routine. But this time felt different. It was spoken aloud, in the middle of the grand room, in front of powerful people, just as a billionaire's reputation was unraveling. Miriam bit her lip, the bitter taste rising to her tongue, and pushed the anger down as far as it would go. Her shoulders trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the fire inside her being held back with every breath. Richard glanced toward Briggs, the look brief but enough to signal agreement. He didn't care about Miriam either. To him, she was just a meaningless shadow in the building, a presence meant to clean the dirt he'd never have to touch. People like Miriam, in Richard's eyes, didn't deserve attention. He focused on masking his own discomfort, but her silence only made the scene more suffocating. Miriam didn't respond, yet when she lifted her eyes, they flashed with a glare cold as steel. It passed in a split second, but Briggs felt a chill. He quickly turned away, trying to maintain his smug expression, though the unease had already set in. Inside the meeting room, the mental chaos was becoming obvious. A few people kept whispering, murmurs mixing with stifled laughs. Richard kept barking orders, but no one was truly listening anymore. The Chinese business people spoke among themselves, some shaking their heads in disappointment. Miriam kept gripping her cloth tightly, taking deep breaths to stay composed. She knew that if she spoke up, she'd be thrown out instantly, branded as disrespectful. But inside her, a fire had been lit, slow burning and ready to explode when the moment came. Contempt hadn't made her smaller, it had sharpened her like a blade, waiting for the chance to cut straight through the arrogance that ruled this place. Minutes passed heavily. Everyone could feel the power imbalance, the public humiliation, and the weight of failure settling in. And in the middle of it all, the image of Miriam standing silently, her rough hands clenched around the cloth, became an invisible anchor. No one noticed, but that contained fury was the beginning of a shift, the first moment in a fall that would force this entire room to bow in silence. While the hearing was still unfolding in a tense atmosphere with no clear resolution in sight, another shockwave suddenly hit, sweeping through the entire leadership tier of the company like an unannounced storm. A series of internal documents were leaked. No one knew from where, no one claimed responsibility, but all were verified originals bearing official seals. Among them, the most striking were files bearing the direct signature of Richard Halden, the chief executive officer, once praised as a financial mastermind. These documents revealed that he had approved a series of harsh benefit cuts targeting lower-level employees, from scaling back health insurance coverage and eliminating all holiday bonuses to having the Workplace Injury Support Fund. Each item dated, annotated, even marked with handwritten notes in his signature slanted script, unnecessary for General Labor Group, prioritized deep cuts. In the past, Richard had been regarded as a cold but effective leader, someone willing to make tough decisions for the long-term good of the company. But now, with the undeniable truth exposed, that image collapsed entirely. He was no longer seen as a principled executive, but as someone who had knowingly sacrificed the welfare of the most vulnerable to protect profit margins for the executive class. Every line in the documents was not just evidence, but a cold incision into the trust of the thousands who had worked under him. Major newspapers, already watching the hearing closely, jumped in as if they had been waiting for this moment. The media erupted, front pages updated constantly to keep pace with the latest headline. The man who called a janitor trash. Turns out he's looked down on everyone all along. Within hours, the leaked documents had flooded social media. Journalists dissected every figure, every note, pointing out that the cuts were no coincidence or market necessity, but a systematic policy carried out steadily over the years. The articles spread at lightning speed. Public outrage, already ignited by what had happened to Miriam, exploded further, viewing this as the final nail in the coffin of Richard Halden's reputation. At the same time, Briggs could no longer escape the storm. The investigative committee issued an official statement. His action, from racially charged insults to physically shoving Miriam, would be examined under charges of workplace racism and assault. Each video clip was shown publicly. The look of contempt, the voice dripping with bias, and the brutal shove aimed at a woman who did not fight back. The footage played repeatedly on television and social media, forming a living indictment that no lawyer could refute. In the interrogation room, Briggs was no longer the confident, talkative man he had once been. He sat rigid, face pale, eyes avoiding contact, each answer stuttering, hesitant. Every time he attempted to explain himself, another video played, and his words fell apart. The press called him the man who humiliated dignity, while social activist groups declared that the investigation into Briggs was the first victory for justice after too many years of denial. Inside the company, chaos reached its peak. No one could stay silent anymore. Employees at every level, from administrative staff and technical specialists to warehouse workers, began to speak up. Internal meetings turned into forums for accusation. Many recounted witnessing colleagues being shouted at, denied raises despite good performance, and excluded from promotion lists simply because their background wasn't appropriate. Some shared that they had filed complaints but were told to withdraw them if they didn't want to be blacklisted. Journalists compiled these stories and published them as a multi-part series, each article a painful glimpse into a rotten corporate culture that had survived far too long behind a mask of success. Richard Halden, meanwhile, sat alone in the top-floor office that had once symbolized the company's power. Through the bulletproof glass, he looked down at the city moving as usual. Busy traffic, hurried crowds, buildings still lit as if nothing had happened. But in his mind, everything was unraveling. On his desk lay stacks of newspapers with brutal headlines. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages from the board. His assistant announcing emergency meeting, lawyers demanding public statements. But he sat frozen. Once a man who believed that money and connections could cover any flaw, he now had nothing left but solitude, and a growing sense of humiliation gripped him to the core. As public outrage intensified, shareholders lost patience. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings were held, no longer discussing strategic vision or long-term reform, but focusing on one thing: how to sever ties with Richard Halden as quickly as possible. Major investment funds, which had once defended him at all costs, began to pull out. No lengthy statements, just cold notices. "We no longer see sustainable value in the current leadership." The market reacted instantly. Company stock plummeted, losing nearly 40% of its value in just 3 days. Red numbers blanketed electronic boards at headquarters and across trading floors. Individual investors panicked and sold off. Commentators on live broadcasts remarked, "This isn't just a corporate collapse, it's the cost of blind faith in unethical leadership." Richard tried to hold on. He called every major shareholder, sent out recovery plans, offered pay cuts, promised to rebuild the benefit system, but all he received were silence or blunt reply. "We no longer trust you." Every door he once walked through with confidence now shut in his face. No good luck wishes, no handshakes, just the cold turning of backs from those who once called him a visionary. His fall didn't come from the outside, but from the very system that once lifted him, and that made the fall all the more devastating. The special board meeting unfolded under a lead-heavy atmosphere. The conference room was sealed off from the media, with tightened security, but no one could stop the stream of information leaking out. Richard entered, still in a neat black suit, hair carefully combed, but without a trace of the commanding presence of a powerful CEO. The board members no longer looked at him as a peer, but as a debt to be settled. On the table were folders marked in red, loss analysis reports, compiled accusation, investigative files, and finally, the resolution demanding he step down from all executive roles. One by one, the members spoke. "We can no longer associate our names with yours. This company needs a fresh start, and that begins with your departure." The moment the statement was read aloud, Richard sat motionless. No reaction, no argument. It was as if he knew every effort had already become meaningless. Leaning back against the leather chair, his figure seemed smaller in the vast room. His face flushed red, sweat beading at his temple. His vacant eyes stared into the void, as if searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing left. The CEO title was stripped. All authority suspended. No more statements, no longer addressed as the boss. All that remained was a former leader publicly removed in disgrace. The news spread like fire igniting gasoline. News outlets are updated by the minute. Headlines exploded across front pages. Richard Halden loses CEO seat in disgrace. Dozens of cameras waited outside headquarters. When Richard emerged, there was no security escort, no private car waiting at the gate. He walked through a gray drizzle, face pale, head bowed low. Camera flashes fired non-stop. Reporters shouted questions. "Do you regret anything? Will you apologize to the public? Do you have anything to say to Miriam Cole?" But Richard gave no reply. He simply walked on, drifting past the crowd like a shadow, the shadow of a man who once stood at the peak of power. Now fallen so far, he no longer had the words to defend himself. The public showed no sympathy. They saw his downfall as expected, even necessary. People compared the footage of him mocking Miriam with the image of him bowing his head as he exited headquarters, to witness the full arc of justice. Commentary pieces emphasized, this isn't just the failure of one individual, but a wake-up call for an entire generation of leaders who believe power is exempt from morality. And when all the noise died down, what remained in the silence was a single, cold truth. Richard Halden had destroyed himself, not through financial missteps, but through the arrogance and contempt he once called leadership strategy. The ripple of laughter hadn't fully faded when Richard Halden lost all control. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a hammer blow through the already fractured atmosphere. His face flushed red, neck veins bulging, eyes darting wildly in rage and despair. He shouted, voice hoarse, each word hurled like a weapon. "I need a translator, not trash standing here." The words didn't just shatter the silence. They served as a verdict, publicly casting Miriam Cole into the lowest possible role at the very center of power. The word trash rang against the four-glass wall, so heavy that a few employees lowered their heads in shame, while others exchanged looks, none brave enough to respond. Officer Briggs immediately seized the moment to prove his loyalty to the CEO. He strode forward, face twisted in smug satisfaction. Without hesitation, he shoved Miriam hard on the shoulder, the force rough and unfiltered, making her stumble. His voice sliced the air, each word drawn out with deliberate cruelty. "Out, your filth." The sound hit Miriam's ears like a cold slap. Briggs's fingers pressed into the thin fabric of her uniform, leaving behind an ache and a sting of humiliation. The violence made some staff freeze, but no one stepped forward to stop it. They all just watched, letting the moment play out like a scene from a play they believed Miriam was born to lose. Miriam staggered a few steps, the cloth slipping from her hand and landing on the polished tile floor, leaving a faint wet mark. That small sound rang in her head like an alarm bell. She stopped at the threshold, one hand gripping the cold wooden frame, her breath unsteady, but her gaze focused. For a few seconds, everything seemed to halt. No one noticed that it was her calm defiance that caused Briggs to flinch, if only briefly, before he masked it with a smug tilt of his chin. Miriam didn't leave. She stood firm, shoulders squared, delivering a silent challenge that she wouldn't be erased from the picture so easily. Meanwhile, Richard grew more frantic. He spun back toward the Chinese business delegation, his voice rushed and crumbling, trying to reconnect with meaningless English phrases, but Mr. Zhang had run out of patience. He stared sharply, his Mandarin voice cutting through, crisp and final. "We're leaving now." The words struck the room like a gust of cold wind, extinguishing Richard's last flicker of power. The business people stood at once, chairs scraping loudly, their movements firm and without hesitation. Each footstep across the glossy tile only amplified Richard's humiliation, turning him into a lone figure inside the very empire he once ruled with pride. The remaining employees watched in shock. Some looked down, pretending to take notes, avoiding eye contact. Others glanced toward Miriam, still standing at the door. The image of the black janitor just shoved aside now stood in sharp contrast to the billionaire unraveling before international partners. The invisible shift had already begun, but no one noticed in time. Miriam's shadow stretched across the bright floor, like a signal that real strength did not sit in leather chairs, but stood quietly in the form of a woman dismissed yet unbowed. Richard collapsed into his chair, hands trembling as he crumpled the notepaper in his grip. He had never felt this close to collapse. Outside, the footsteps of the departing business delegation echoed farther and farther away, but that sound would haunt him like a death knell. The room, once built to project power, had become a glass cage exposing the rawness of pride, where a billionaire CEO lost control, an arrogant police officer fed his own ego, and a janitor was humiliated but still standing at the edge, waiting for her moment to turn the game around. The air in the meeting room remained thick after the Chinese business delegation firmly announced its decision to leave. The sharp screech of chairs being pulled back rang out, and Richard Halden felt as if he had been thrown into a pit, while Officer Briggs wore a smug grin, believing he had just proven the power of a gatekeeper. Miriam Cole still stood at the doorway, where light from the wide glass wall cast a glow on her slender frame. Her narrow shoulders trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a slow-burning fire rising from deep restraint. In that moment of chaos, it was her silence that became the loudest void in the room, a stillness that made every footstep, every sharp breath from Richard, echo louder than ever. Then Miriam took a deep breath, her eyes flashing with resolve. She turned and walked back into the room, her stride firm, no longer the silent woman who had endured humiliation behind glass walls. The sound of her footsteps echoed, heavy and sharp, like hammer strikes opening a new door. When she reached the center of the room, she stopped, pulled off the yellow rubber gloves she had worn all morning, and placed them on the table with purpose. The faint sound of their drop rang out like a starting gun, shattering the wall of prejudice that had buried her for so long. Her voice cut through the room, cold and unwavering. Wait. Two simple words, but in a space on the verge of collapse, they landed like a command. Every eye turned toward her, shifting from contempt to stunned confusion, as if no one could believe a janitor had dared to interrupt at such a critical moment. Miriam held her head high, her gaze unflinching. She looked straight at Mr. Zhang, then began to speak fluent Mandarin. Her tone was steady, fluid, and precise, repeating word for word the questions Mr. Zhang had directed at Richard. Each syllable came out like a clear stream, confident and articulate, silencing the entire room. The Mandarin syllables echoed through the cold space, reaching every ear, so sharp that even those who didn't understand the language could feel their weight and accuracy. Those who had mocked her only minutes earlier now sat frozen, as if they had swallowed steel, unable to deny the fluency that could not be faked. Mr. Zhang and his associates stopped immediately, their astonished eyes locked onto Miriam. They exchanged quick remarks, their voices lowered but still filled with surprise. Mr. Zhang tilted his head, a faint smile of recognition forming, then asked another question in Mandarin, this time with clear intent to test her. Without hesitation, Miriam responded fluently, her eyes bright and her phrasing as exact and natural as a professional interpreter. The delegation was visibly impressed. Some nodded, others whispered, flawless. In that moment, the balance tipped entirely in Miriam's favor, transforming her from someone dismissed into the only person holding the key to saving the situation. The room fell silent. Richard sat with his mouth agape, eyes wide, fingers twitching on the table as if grasping at invisible air. He couldn't believe that the woman he had just humiliated could speak the very language he had never understood. Each syllable from Miriam struck like a slap, exposing the hollow arrogance of a billionaire accustomed to power and obedience. Officer Briggs stared, his smug expression wiped clean, replaced by discomfort and confusion. The smug laughter he had sparked now betrayed him, shrinking him down and laying bare his ignorance in front of everyone. Miriam stood tall, hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, no longer looking down, no longer avoiding stares. She now held the full attention of the room, from international executives to the staff who had once mocked her. Her composure clashed starkly with Richard's unraveling, highlighting one undeniable truth. She hadn't just salvaged the meeting, she had flipped the entire power dynamic. In that moment, Miriam was no longer the janitor pushed out of the room, but the central figure in the hall, the only person capable of steering the negotiation back on course. The atmosphere shifted quickly. The mocking whispers vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed into every corner. No one dared laugh anymore, because just seconds ago, they had ridiculed the very person they now depended on. Miriam didn't need to raise her voice or make any grand gesture. Her calm presence and sharp words were enough to redirect every gaze in the room. Shame began to settle on those present. A few heads bowed, eyes turned away, but everyone understood that the insults thrown moments earlier had only diminished themselves. Mr. Zhang finally spoke, this time in English, his tone steady and low. "We can proceed, if she translates." His words landed like a verdict, sealing off any chance for Richard to recover his dignity. The billionaire who had screamed for her removal was now pushed aside in his own boardroom. Richard lowered his head, speechless, because the truth was undeniable. Everything now revolved around Miriam. Briggs stood near the door, trying to steady his breathing. He muttered something, but no one listened, and no one cared. In the eyes of everyone, the man who had shoved Miriam out was now nothing more than a pathetic figure, a symbol of empty arrogance. Miriam glanced at him, her stare ice cold. She didn't speak a word, but it was enough to make Briggs feel nailed to the floor. The entire room settled into a new state. Miriam at the center, Richard dethroned, Briggs uneasy, and the Chinese business people seated upright with quiet respect. Light from the glass wall spilled in, casting a glow on Miriam's upright posture, turning her into a symbol of a kind of power no one had anticipated. In the room where prejudice had just been laid bare, truth had flipped in an instant. Miriam didn't wear a triumphant smile. She remained calm. In her eyes was a silent message. Human dignity is never measured by job title or skin color, but by ability and intellect. Those who had clung to arrogance now sat with nothing but shame. And in that moment, the story turned a page completely, where the one once trampled now stood as the light brought the entire hall to silence. Silence filled the room after Miriam Cole spoke fluent Mandarin. Richard Halden still sat frozen. Briggs stared as if turned to stone, and the Chinese business delegation had fully shifted their attention to the janitor. In the middle of the stifling tension, in a corner of the room, a young employee clutched his phone tightly. He had originally meant to capture a few shots to joke with friends about the CEO's meltdown, but when the camera accidentally caught the moment Miriam removed her yellow gloves, stood tall, and began speaking Mandarin like a professional interpreter, instinct told him this was a moment not to miss. His fingers trembled slightly, but he kept the camera steady, tracking Miriam's every move. The short clip needed no filters, no captions, but its impact far outweighed any headline. Just hours later, when the meeting paused, the video surfaced on an internal forum and quickly spread beyond it. The original title was simple but cutting: "Janitor saves billionaire from collapse." One line, paired with an image of Miriam standing at the center of the room, with Richard pale in the background and Briggs still stunned, was enough to spark curiosity. People clicked, then were instantly drawn into the strange scene. A billionaire CEO drenched in sweat and speechless, while a black janitor spoke such fluent Mandarin that international businessmen nodded in approval. Social media exploded within hours. The hashtag #RespectMiriam flooded Twitter, Facebook, and even Weibo, accompanied by waves of praise. Alongside it, another hashtag surged with even sharper momentum, #WrongTarget, cutting straight at Richard. Thousands shared the clip with biting captions like, "He thought she was beneath him. She's the one who saved his empire." Influential voices quickly joined in, slamming Richard's blind arrogance and Briggs's demeaning behavior. In less than 24 hours, the video crossed the million-view mark, becoming a global conversation. Richard discovered the video's virality on a night that should have been a celebration, but instead, he sat collapsed in front of his screen, watching himself being turned into a global joke. His face darkened, eyes wide as he saw his image plastered across every platform. A man in a luxury suit, sweating, stammering like a fool, while the woman he had called trash stood tall and shone. Every click, every share, felt like a needle jabbing at his pride. He gripped his computer mouse and hurled it to the floor, but it was useless. The media storm had already spun far out of his control. Meanwhile, Miriam sat in her small room, unaware that a spontaneous moment was now shaking an entire city. Her phone vibrated non-stop with messages, praise, and words of encouragement. Many complete strangers wrote to her, "You're my inspiration. I used to be looked down on, but you showed me that true worth can't be trampled." Miriam read each message, surprised and hesitant, because she had never imagined that something so simple, a language skill, a moment of standing tall, could become the thing that made the world stop and listen. Outside, the media didn't miss their chance. Major news outlets ran headlines laced with irony. Billionaire embarrassed, Janitor saves the day. News programs analyzed the clip, freezing on the moment Miriam removed her gloves and placing it side by side with Richard's shaken expression, creating a bitter contrast. Anchors said, "This isn't just a story about language, but a reflection of how society treats those it deems unimportant." Human rights experts joined in, turning the viral video into a forum about racial and class discrimination. As for Briggs, the officer who had shoved Miriam out of the room, he quickly became the most criticized figure in the story. Internet users dug up images of him with his smug face, pairing them with mocking captions like, "This kind only knows how to scrub toilets." That cruel sentence was now repeated everywhere, but this time not in agreement. It was a wave of fury directed at him. Under each post, thousands of comments demanded, "Fire him now. Someone like that should never be allowed to protect the public." Briggs tried deleting his social media accounts, but it was too late. His image had become a stain that couldn't be erased. Every time Richard picked up his phone, he saw his face turned into a punchline in endless meme. A CEO crying into his hands with the caption, "Where's my translator?" Or an edited photo of him shrunk into a shadow while Miriam stood glowing at the center. Some even showed Miriam in a judge's robe standing at the bench, with Richard kneeling below, an image of reversed power. The joke spread like wildfire, only deepening Richard's sense that the entire world was reveling in his downfall. But beneath all the noise, a deeper message was rising. People weren't just talking about Miriam's fluency in Mandarin, they were asking the bigger questions. How could a janitor be this skilled? And why was she treated so cruelly in the very company she served? Those questions quickly sparked broader conversations about race, class, and what human worth truly means in modern society. Miriam became an unexpected symbol, living proof that talent and dignity can be buried, but never erased. In one evening, the entire city felt flipped upside down. In coffee shops, on subway trains, and inside offices, people played the clip and talked. Each person had their own interpretation, but overall, everyone shared a certain satisfaction in seeing arrogance fall, and a deep emotion in watching the scorned rise by the strength of intellect. That spread wasn't just a passing wave, it was turning into a media storm, strong enough to carry lasting consequences. And just as Richard shattered yet another phone in a fit of rage, he knew clearly that no power, no amount of money in his hands, could stop a tide of public opinion that had chosen to stand with Miriam Cole. As the video of Miriam Cole standing up and translating Mandarin spread across platforms, the first comments began to appear. At first, they were a few short lines, but by the next morning, they had become a roaring wave, flooding every corner of social media. Beneath the post with millions of views, one comment was pinned to the top: "Talent isn't in the suit, it's in the mind." The words were simple but razor sharp, and they were quickly shared hundreds of thousands of times, becoming the slogan of a new movement. People no longer saw the video as a funny mishap, but as a mirror reflecting society. A billionaire sitting helpless, while a woman once dismissed stood tall to save the meeting. Soon after, an anonymous account released a second clip, capturing the moment Officer Briggs shoved Miriam out of the room and shouted, "Out, you're filth!" That image, combined with the harsh tone, was the final straw. If Richard's panic had sparked smug satisfaction, Briggs's brutality ignited raw outrage. Comments poured in like a flood. "Fire him now! A man who carries a gun and insults workers doesn't deserve to wear a badge. We need a full investigation into racial bias." Every keystroke tore through the image of Briggs, turning him into the epicenter of public fury. Within hours, action-driven hashtags surged, demanding that Briggs be held accountable, and Richard issue a public apology to Miriam. People didn't just comment, they sent formal complaints to Richard's company, to police oversight boards, and even launched an online petition. The number of signatures soared by the hour. Each screen refresh showed thousands more, a living testament to the power of collective outrage when justice feels violated. Meanwhile, Miriam sat quietly in her small apartment, watching her phone light up non-stop. She wasn't used to this kind of noise, but each message that appeared left her breathless. A young woman wrote, "You showed me no one gets to decide my worth." A middle-aged man messaged, "My boss once called me useless, but because of you, I don't feel alone anymore." Even strangers from across the globe wrote in different languages, all echoing the same idea. Miriam's presence had become a source of inspiration. In just one day, her inbox overflowed with thousands of messages, enough to stun even a celebrity, let alone a janitor long accustomed to silence and invisibility. The media kept the wave going. On talk shows, commentators spoke bluntly. Briggs didn't just insult one woman, he insulted an entire working class. Another added, "The way Miriam responded proves that dignity stands above any uniform. She didn't yell, didn't strike back. She used knowledge to silence them all." That line was quoted everywhere, turning Miriam into an unexpected symbol in the fight against prejudice. As for Richard, alone in his private room, his face flushed with shame as he scrolled past headlines screaming, "Billionaire bows, Janitor rises," and "A hard truth for the arrogant." He tried to lift the phone to call his PR team, but knew deep down that any effort to control the narrative was now meaningless. The wave of social media outrage couldn't be smothered with denial. The more he denied, the angrier people became. The more he tried to hide, the deeper the truth was dragged into the light. In forums for immigrant workers, Miriam's story became a beacon of hope. People shared the video with captions like, "If she can do it, so can we." In schools, teachers used her example to remind students, never judge someone by their job. Anti-racism groups saw it as living proof of everything they had fought for. From what seemed like a small incident, a spark had become a wildfire, spreading far beyond the borders of the United States. Miriam looked in the mirror, gently touching her cheek, as if trying to confirm the woman in the video was really her. She hadn't sought the spotlight, never intended to become a symbol, but the wave of support pouring in made her realize this was no longer a personal story. She thought of Briggs, of Richard, the ones who had pushed her into the shadows, and understood that it was their cruelty that had accidentally lifted her up. She exhaled quietly, picked up her phone, and replied to a few messages with simple words of thanks. Each response was treasured by the recipient, then shared again, making the ripple grow wider. Outside, Briggs faced a massive storm of backlash. His image flooded every forum, paired with demands for consequences. He had once believed Richard's power would shield him, but now even Richard was faltering. Those who had stood with him began to pull away, afraid of being swept into the raid. Briggs gripped his phone, reading insult after insult, call after call for discipline, and slammed it down on the table. But the anger couldn't erase the truth. He had become the most hated figure in the story. The wave of outrage kept rising, pulling everything into a current no one could resist. From a video less than a minute long, the entire society was now talking about justice, dignity, and the truth that every ounce of arrogance could be undone by one moment of standing tall. And in the eye of the storm stood Miriam Cole, the woman once called filth, now the face that made millions say in unison, "Respect her." After 2 days under heavy fire, Richard Halden finally decided to fight back. He summoned his media team and hired an elite PR firm, spending a massive fee just to release one short message: "We have always respected all employees." The statement aired on television, appeared across digital news outlets, and even showed up on billboards in the city center. In it, Richard wore a crisp suit, his face straining to appear calm, his voice low but uneasy. He emphasized that his company had always seen employees as its foundation and would never tolerate discrimination. Every word was carefully crafted, but the more people listened, the more it felt like a clumsy performance. Social media fired back instantly. The first comments poured cold water over the show. "Then why did you kick her out in front of everyone? Respect? You called her trash. Don't talk. Watch the video." Within an hour, hashtags criticizing Richard's statement climbed the trending charts. Tens of thousands reminded others of the moment he shouted in the meeting room, a far cry from the polished image on camera. Popular accounts posted side-by-side memes, one of Richard declaring, "We respect all employees," the other of him pointing at Miriam and yelling. The caption below mocked him, the art of saying one thing and doing another. If Richard had thought his PR campaign would cool the backlash, reality proved otherwise. It only fueled the fire. The video of Briggs shoving Miriam out of the meeting room resurfaced and spread even more widely. Users added captions like, "Is this what the CEO calls respect?" Satirical clips were edited and replayed millions of times, turning Briggs from an anonymous security officer into a hated name across forums. One viral video looped the moment Briggs pushed Miriam, intercut with laughing sound effects and flashing text that read, "The CEO's hero." The sarcasm didn't just ruin Briggs's image, it cast Richard as his silent accomplice. Briggs had now become the ultimate target. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the weight of disgusted stares. Neighbors whispered, co-workers avoided him. His phone overflowed with hateful messages. In interviews, when reporters asked Richard about Briggs, he answered coldly, "The company has no ties to security staff." But that denial only made the public angrier, because it was clear Briggs had acted with Richard's unspoken approval. While Richard and Briggs sank into crisis, Miriam became the most mentioned name in international headlines. Media from Asia, Europe, and Africa all covered her story. The image of Miriam removing her yellow gloves and speaking Mandarin aired during prime time, with several networks replaying the clip as a textbook example of social justice and reversal of prejudice. Major newspapers called her the janitor who changed the game. One headline read, Miriam Cole, from the shadows to the global spotlight. Miriam's phone would not stop buzzing. Interview requests from media outlets, collaboration offers from language organizations, and even letters of encouragement from human rights groups poured in. She had only ever wanted to live a quiet life, but now, the world had placed her in the role of a symbol. Everywhere, people spoke her name as proof of human worth. Those who had once been looked down on used her story as strength to rise. In the public's eyes, Miriam was no longer a janitor. She was the image of intellect rising above every barrier. During those chaotic days, the image of Richard's face flushed purple, his eyes burning with rage as he stared at his phone screen, was retold by staff like folklore. He sat locked in his office, smashing 2 phones and throwing his laptop to the floor. But nothing changed, because every time he destroyed one device, millions of new views piled up outside his wall. He could feel it. Power and money were no longer enough to protect his reputation. The more he tried to salvage it, the deeper he sank into humiliation. And Miriam, who had once quietly wiped down glossy table, was now the center of a global conversation. From a silent symbol, she had become an international focus. Her story didn't just expose the emptiness of Richard's words, or the cruelty of Briggs's action. It reminded millions that dignity and talent will always find their way into the light. The news of the viral video had yet to settle when another wave crashed down on Richard Halden, this time from within his own company. On Monday morning, major shareholders simultaneously issued letters calling for an emergency meeting, not to discuss new strategies, but to directly question the CEO's credibility. The boardroom was packed that day, powerful faces seated around the long table, their eyes colder than steel. A veteran shareholder spoke first, calm but heavy. We've lost hundreds of millions in just 2 days due to the plummeting stock price. Can you explain why a janitor became the one to salvage this company while you turned it into a global joke? The words sliced through the mask Richard had spent years crafting. He tried to appear composed, but under the table, his hands clenched tight, turning purple. The pressure grew when a live broadcast from Shanghai aired the Chinese partner's official statement. Mr. Zhang appeared on screen, standing before dozens of reporters, his voice low and precise. We will only continue negotiations if Miriam Cole is the official interpreter. We no longer trust the current leadership. The firm's statement went global, sounding like a public sentence against Richard. Inside the boardroom, shareholders exchanged looks, then turned toward him with visible suspicion. Another slammed a stack of documents on the table. Even our partners don't want to work with you. Do you think we can still trust that chair you're sitting in? Richard stammered, grasping for a way out. He spoke of investment plans, upcoming projects, but his shaky voice and unfocused eyes betrayed everything. The shareholders no longer cared for promises. They wanted concrete answers. A younger member, representing a new group of investors, said bluntly, "We're not paying for arrogance. We want results. And right now, the results are on Miriam Cole's side, not yours." The words landed heavily, thickening the air in the room, and Richard felt an invisible rope tightening around his neck, inch by inch. Meanwhile, outside that room, public pressure continued to intensify. Every news outlet dissected the fact that the international deal now hinged on a janitor, and that the board would have to decide whether to keep or remove a CEO who had turned the company into a global laughingstock. Reports repeatedly mentioned the Chinese side's conditions, showing footage of Miriam stepping out of a modest building, wrapped in an old coat, her face calm, eyes clear. That contrast only amplified the pressure on Richard. No matter how he tried to reshape his image, he now looked like a man unraveling, while Miriam steadily became the face of credibility. The meeting dragged on for hours, and with every passing minute, Richard was pushed further into a corner. He realized that it wasn't just public opinion outside turning against him. Even those who had once shared elegant dinners and billion-dollar deals were now looking at him with the cold gaze of strangers. A loneliness he had never known began to close in, and Richard understood clearly that his time in the seat of power was running out. Following Mr. Zhang's statement, the media turned their full attention to Richard Halden. News channels ran repeated clips of him sitting helplessly in the boardroom, spliced with footage of Miriam Cole translating with clarity and strength, emphasizing the stark contrast. Journalists who once praised Richard as a symbol of success now wrote with cutting clarity, "A CEO who cannot protect his own dignity cannot earn the trust of partners." Financial publications demanded he issue a public apology, not only to ease public anger, but to stop the plummeting stock value. Every day, reporters camped outside company headquarters, microphones raised, firing off the same question. "Do you admit to insulting Miriam Cole? Will you apologize to her in public?" These questions pounded into Richard's mind like hammer, making it hard hard to breathe even behind closed office doors. Shareholders began raising the issue in emergency meeting, calling an apology the only way to cool public outrage and protect the brand. A board member spoke directly. "This is no longer about you. It's about the company's survival. If you refuse to apologize, we will have to consider other options." The warning echoed through the room, tightening the pressure on Richard. He knew an apology might soften the backlash, but to him, it would mean admitting defeat, conceding that a janitor had brought him down on a global stage. Seething with frustration, Richard kept a composed exterior, but his thoughts were in turmoil. He was not used to, and never willing to, bow to anyone, least of all Miriam Cole, a woman he had dismissed just days earlier. Being forced into that position felt humiliating, as if the legacy he had spent a lifetime building was being crushed under a wave he could no longer control. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that he had to do something to prove Miriam wasn't worthy of the praise. In secret, Richard called a few trusted associates, media contacts who had once benefited from his favors. In hushed conversation, he gave a clear directive: dig into Miriam's past, find any weakness that could turn her from a hero into someone questionable. One of them warned that it might backfire if discovered, but Richard dismissed the concern coldly. "I don't care, as long as people stop worshipping her." His words revealed the bitterness and desperation of a man slipping beyond the edge of control. Vague rumors began surfacing on a few minor forums. Claims that Miriam had dropped out of school, that she had financial issues, that her current job proved she was unqualified. But instead of turning public opinion against her, those rumors were quickly debunked. People uncovered records showing that Miriam had once been an outstanding language student, that she left college only due to financial hardship, not incompetence. The more attempts were made to smear her, the more her image in the public eye shone brighter. She became a symbol for capable individuals pushed to the margins of society, a figure of endurance and resilience. Richard still refused to stop. He continued ordering those still loyal to him to dig deeper, even if it meant paying a high price. But the harder he pushed, the more it felt like he was digging his own grave. Public outrage no longer focused solely on Briggs. Richard's behavior in the meeting room, now it had a new target: his deliberate attempt to destroy a woman who had stood up with intelligence. Every fabricated accusation became another reason for the public to tighten the noose, dragging Richard deeper into a crisis of his own making. While Richard Halden was still scrambling to salvage his reputation and discredit Miriam Cole, a new incident erupted like a spark tossed into a pool of gasoline. A second video clip suddenly surfaced on social media, not showing Miriam's moment of translating in fluent Chinese, but the brutal moment before, when Officer Briggs shoved her out of the meeting room. The image of the cleaning rag dropping to the glossy tile floor, Miriam stumbling at the threshold, face strained but composed, was clearly captured by a hidden employee's phone. The clip lasted less than 10 seconds, but its impact outweighed any news article. Below the video, a stark, weighty caption read, "The one who saved the meeting was still treated like nothing." That sentence struck like an indictment, not just against individual, but against an entire system. It was no longer personal mockery, but a knock on the conscience of society. Within hours, the clip had been shared hundreds of thousands of times, quickly surpassing the million mark. People online were no longer just talking about Miriam's language skills. Now they saw the truth behind the praise. Before being celebrated, she had endured public humiliation and violence. One person wrote, "Without this video, we'd never know how cruelly she was treated." Another commented in outrage, "Is this what Richard Halden calls respecting employees?" Old hashtags surged again, joined by new ones demanding justice for Miriam and accountability for Briggs. International media jumped on the story. Major news channels replayed the moment Briggs shoved Miriam, while human rights experts were interviewed to dissect the act as a blatant display of class and racial prejudice. A prominent journalist wrote on their personal page, "The world may admire Miriam now, but let's not forget that before she astonished everyone, she was humiliated in the moment that mattered most." The post went viral, solidifying Miriam's status not just as a symbol of brilliance, but of endurance and resistance. For Richard, this second clip was a devastating blow. If the first video turned him into a joke, this one made him a collaborator. People were no longer just focusing on his incompetence, but now questioned his responsibility. "You were there," they asked. "You saw Briggs humiliate Miriam. Why didn't you stop it? Is this the corporate culture you created?" The outrage spread like an oil slick, transforming him into a global target of public criticism. Meanwhile, Miriam was surrounded by a wave of empathy from the online community. People recreated the image of her stumbling at the meeting room door, pairing it with solemn music to emphasize that even when pushed out, she stood tall and came back to save the negotiation. One user wrote, "She didn't just translate a language, she translated a lesson for the whole world. Human dignity cannot be shoved out the door." The quote spread rapidly, turning Miriam into the center of a growing social movement. Briggs became the target of intense backlash. His personal accounts were flooded, and the image of his smug face in the meeting room was mocked everywhere. Any attempt at justification was rejected, as the footage spoke too clearly to be denied. The public demanded more than an apology. They wanted disciplinary action, even prosecution. Briggs tried to reach out to Richard for help, but Richard himself was already drowning in crisis, unable to save even his own name. What was once a relationship between the arrogant and the protector had now become two pieces on a chessboard cornered by public outrage, with no escape left. The power of the second clip surpassed anything anyone had anticipated. It didn't just highlight the injustice Miriam endured, it exposed the full arrogance of those who had mocked her. With one simple caption, "The one who saved the meeting was still treated like nothing," the world understood that the issue was never about one person, but about how this society operates. From that moment, Miriam's story was no longer just viral content. It became a symbol of a harsh truth. Justice begins with protecting the ones we usually overlook. An unprecedented media storm followed the spread of the second clip. Millions shared the same message, short but filled with fury. # Justice for Miriam. Within a day, it shot to the top of trending lists across all platforms, surpassing even major international events. Every post, photo, and video reinforced one idea: Miriam deserved respect, and those who humiliated her must be held accountable. Online, people kept remixing the image of Briggs pushing Miriam, adding bold red text. "This is their version of justice." The stream of outrage was endless, turning into a call for action and formal accountability. In small protests across several cities, people carried signs that read, "Justice for Miriam," her image displayed on banners and posters as a symbol for all who had ever been dismissed. In public spaces, students pasted flyers showing the moment Miriam stood tall in the meeting room, beneath slogans calling for fairness. Live television shows constantly invited scholars and social advocates to discuss the case, and they unanimously agreed that this was no isolated incident, proof of long-standing inequality. The wave of anger spread globally, turning Miriam from an unknown name into a modern symbol of justice. Richard Halden, once perched at the height of power, had officially fallen into crisis. His office was surrounded by reporters, shareholders relentlessly applied pressure, and the online community had painted him as the face of arrogance and hypocrisy. Every time he opened social media, thousands of hateful messages and mocking images appeared, turning him into the world's laughingstock. His attempts to hide behind PR had failed, and his justifications were seen as further insults to a public already seething. Those who once praised him now turned their backs. Allies in the business world distanced themselves, and isolation wrapped around Richard like a glass cage he couldn't escape. Briggs had it even worse, facing not only public backlash, but also the looming threat of job loss and formal investigation. A human rights organization had officially submitted a petition demanding he be held accountable, and the media portrayed him as the embodiment of arrogance and brutality. In the neighborhood where he lived, contemptuous stares followed his every step, making Briggs too ashamed to leave his home. Friends drifted away. Colleagues in the security field avoided even mentioning his name. The clip of him pushing Miriam played on repeat like undeniable evidence, turning any excuse he gave into empty noise. Briggs sank into despair, while Richard stood powerless, no longer in control of the storm. Both of them, once convinced that power and status would shield them, now faced the hard truth that nothing could withstand the force of collective justice. The Justice for Miriam wave didn't just strip them of dignity, it threatened to destroy their careers, wealth, and the social standing they had spent years building. In a single moment, the world had flipped. Miriam Cole stepped from the shadows into the light, while Richard and Briggs plunged into a crisis's black hole, echoing with the roar of millions demanding they answer for what they had done. As the Justice for Miriam movement showed no sign of cooling down, international media unanimously placed the incident on their front pages. Newspapers that usually focused only on financial markets now analyzed the story in detail, framing it as an event that exposed injustice and arrogance among the elite. Major news outlets repeatedly broadcast contrasting images: Miriam Cole standing tall in the conference room, her gaze steady, and Briggs shoving her out the door. One anchor commented, "A single moment that laid bare the distorted structure of power." The widespread media coverage compelled international human rights organizations to take action. They sent official letters demanding an independent investigation, emphasizing that this was not just a personal matter, but a symptom of deeply embedded systemic discrimination. In Washington, a special committee on labor oversight and social equality was urgently formed. Emergency sessions were held back-to-back, inviting experts, lawyers, and labor representatives to speak. On live television, prominent figures called for strict accountability, viewing Miriam as a symbol for millions of low-wage workers who are demeaned every day. The pressure from both domestic and international audiences forced authorities to act swiftly, unwilling to let the case fade away like a fleeting social media spectacle. Briggs was the first to be named in the proceeding. A subpoena was issued, requiring him to appear before the investigative council. When he stepped out of the black car, a crowd of reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing non-stop. Briggs, once puffed up in uniform, now looked pale, his eyes darting nervously. A barrage of questions followed. Do you regret it? What were you thinking when you called Miriam low class? Are you going to resign? He stayed silent, lips pressed tightly, but his strained expression said everything. The trembling at the corner of his mouth betrayed a man who once believed he could push anyone out of a room through sheer force and shouting. The hearing took place in a packed chamber, all eyes fixed on Briggs. Lawyers presented footage from the video, replaying the moment he shoved Miriam as a blatant act of public humiliation. Briggs sat with his head down, sweat beading on his forehead, his face white as paper. His feeble justifications were quickly dismantled in light of the undeniable evidence. One council member concluded, "You didn't just abuse your power. You revealed a deep contempt for human dignity. That is something we cannot tolerate." Images of Briggs at the hearing were immediately broadcast across the country, serving as proof of the downfall of a man who once brazenly humiliated a janitor. Viewers compared his pale, shaken face to his smug expression in the boardroom, illustrating how quickly power dynamics can flip. Editorials harshly criticized him, calling Briggs the personification of arrogance and collapse. Public opinion, already inflamed, now found satisfaction in seeing him exposed under the blinding lights, with nowhere left to hide. The investigation was still ongoing, but the mere fact that Briggs had been brought into the spotlight was enough to convince the public that Miriam was no longer alone. They understood that the truth had slipped beyond the control of the powerful, and that justice was finally beginning to find its ground. Inside the room where Briggs sat pale and trembling as he answered each question, the echoes from outside rang clearer than ever. The call for justice for Miriam, the call for equality for all those who had ever been looked down upon. The next hearing quickly became the center of attention as the name Miriam Cole was called. Her appearance in the chamber silenced the room. No longer just the woman who quietly wiped down tables in a glass tower, Miriam now entered as a key witness. She wore a simple outfit, her face calm, eyes steady and clear. When she sat down before the row of microphones, dozens of cameras turned to capture every expression. A council member spoke first, asking her to recount everything that happened in the conference room that day. Miriam nodded, her voice steady, every detail told without a hint of hesitation. She spoke of the moment she was pushed out the door, of the insults, and of the instant she had to stand up and translate to save the meeting. People listened in silence, each of her words etching deeper into the full picture, proving that what the public had seen was only the surface, behind which lay a long story of endurance. Reporters outside sent constant updates. Headlines across major outlets read, "The Testimony of Miriam Cole." Viewers watching live expressed admiration for how composed she remained in a space usually reserved for the powerful. One journalist wrote, "She didn't try to complain or seek pity. She simply told the truth, and that truth was heavy enough to make the entire room lower their heads." When Miriam left the stand, many in the chamber rose to their feet and applauded, a rare sight in such formal proceedings. Shortly after, Richard Halden was called. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, from solemn to tense. Richard entered in a sharp suit, but his face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. He sat down, hands clenched as if trying to hold on to the last fragments of authority. The council wasted no time. Questions came rapidly. Why didn't you stop Briggs's action? Do you admit to calling Miriam trash? What were you thinking when you allowed your company to become an international disgrace? Richard tried to deflect, citing the pressure of the deal, the chaos, but every word he spoke was met with resistance. His slumped posture at the microphone, his averted gaze, stood in stark contrast to Miriam's composure moments earlier. News of the hearing spread quickly. The press dubbed it the perfect contrast, where Miriam became the voice of truth, and Richard emerged as the symbol of collapsed arrogance. The public saw clearly that the balance had shifted, and that the era of Richard sitting securely in the seat of power had come to an end. During the hearing, when the council asked Miriam to share more about her past, the room fell silent, as if waiting for the final curtain to be lifted. Miriam took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the dozens of lenses pointed at her, and then began speaking calmly. She shared that, before becoming a janitor, she had been an outstanding student majoring in Chinese language at a prestigious university. Throughout her college years, Miriam consistently ranked at the top of her class, praised by professors as one of the most promising students. She participated in numerous competitions, won scholarships, Drops, and once dreamed of becoming a professional interpreter for international organizations. As she recalled that time, a quiet light returned to her eyes, a glimpse of a beautiful memory preserved through all the hardship that followed. But life did not follow the path she had mapped out. Miriam explained that during her final year of university, her mother was diagnosed with a serious illness. Medical bills piled up. The scholarship money was no longer enough, and her part-time jobs barely made a dent. Miriam faced a painful choice: continue on her promising academic journey, or pause everything to care for her mother. She chose family. Dropping out of school was not easy, but in that moment, she knew she could not abandon the person who had given everything to raise her. She left the university, packed away her unfinished books and notebooks, and stepped into the role of janitor in a large office building. Miriam shared this not as a complaint, but to show that sometimes life forces people down paths no one would choose. Yet, even while cleaning floors instead of standing behind a podium, she never let go of her love for language. On her way home from work, she would still listen to Chinese news broadcasts, still read books and newspapers to keep her skills alive. She believed that true knowledge, once earned, would never disappear if one held onto it with patience. As Miriam spoke, many in the room bowed their heads, some with tears in their eyes. They saw themselves in her story, people who had once set aside dreams because of circumstance. A council member nodded slowly, his expression stern yet deeply understanding. Reporters captured every word, knowing this was the turning point that would make the public trust Miriam even more. No one could call her temporarily lucky now, because her fluency was no miracle, but the result of a long, unwavering journey through hardship. Outside, as Miriam's testimony spread, social media erupted once more. Headlines everywhere read, "From top student to janitor, Miriam never let go of her dream." People shared her story as a living example of resilience and devotion. A highlighted comment read, "She may have given up prestige, but she never gave up knowledge." Miriam's image was no longer tied only to the moment she translated in the conference room, but now to sacrifice and inner strength. To Richard Halden, that revelation was nothing short of a crushing blow. He had tried to discredit Miriam by pointing to her lowly job, but now the public clearly saw that behind her janitor's uniform was a person of strength, once brilliantly talented, forced by circumstance to set her dreams aside. Every word Miriam spoke inadvertently turned Richard's past insults into proof of his blindness. In that moment, the scales of justice tilted even more toward the woman once dismissed, and Richard's image sank deeper into public contempt. Miriam continued, her voice low but steady, without a hint of trembling. She said her time working as a janitor in Richard Halden's building had never been easy. Day after day, she walked past contemptuous stares, whispered remarks, and even open ridicule. Some gave her cruel nicknames, others treated her like an object, passing by without a greeting. Worse, she was often the target of people's frustration, scolded by executives because a room wasn't clean enough, or because of a speck of dust on a glass table. Miriam recounted all this not to seek pity, but to show the weight of quiet, daily humiliation and how deeply it wears down a person. She recalled being forced out of elevators by people who said her presence ruined their image. One day, while cleaning the hallway, she overheard mocking laughter behind her, followed by whispers that someone, like her, would never rise above a broom. Every word cut into her dignity, yet Miriam chose silence, knowing that if she reacted, she would immediately be labeled disrespectful and risk losing the job she worked so hard to keep. Some nights, she would sit quietly in her small room, hands still trembling from being shooed away, but by morning, she would rise early, put on yellow gloves, and go back to work. That perseverance, she said, was the truest proof of her worth, one that no one had the right to deny. Miriam didn't forget to speak of the times she was openly harassed. Once, while scrubbing the floor, a group of employees laughed loudly and deliberately threw trash around just to make her bend down and pick it up. Another time, Briggs cornered her in the hallway and muttered a vicious warning that if she didn't know her place, she would be thrown out of the building in disgrace. Miriam mentioned his name without fear, as a public accusation, in front of all who were listening. She didn't go into detail, only emphasized that such humiliation had become routine, a form of invisible violence people like her endured every single day. The entire room fell silent. Council members sat still, eyes fixed on Miriam, and no one spoke to challenge her. A few looked down, sometimes to take notes, sometimes to avoid her gaze. No one could deny her words. The evidence was too clear. The viral clips, witness statements, and Miriam Miriam's own account had woven together into a portrait that could not be refuted. That silence, rather than making Miriam feel alone, felt like an admission that the truth had finally prevailed. The room fell so silent that one could hear the scratch of a pen across paper. A journalist later described the moment as a silence heavier than 1,000 words, because it proved that no one dared defend Richard or Briggs anymore. In that very silence, Miriam felt a weight lift from her shoulder. She didn't need applause, nor did she crave praise. Just seeing that the people before her had no argument left, she knew justice had made real progress. And so, in the very room built on power, the woman once dismissed was now the one who silenced the entire council. While the hearing was still ongoing, a sudden leak of confidential documents sent Richard Halden's position into free fall. Major newspapers simultaneously published copies of internal memos showing that Richard himself had approved policies cutting benefits for lower-tier employees. Health insurance was reduced, holiday bonuses were eliminated, and even the Workplace Injury Support Fund was slashed by half. Previously seen as merely arrogant, Richard now appeared as someone who had deliberately oppressed the vulnerable to protect his own profits. One headline read coldly, "The man who called a janitor trash has long disrespected all his employees." The public, already outraged, exploded anew, treating this as the final piece of evidence to strip Richard of any remaining credibility. Alongside Richard's collapse, Briggs also reached a dead end. The investigative committee officially announced that his actions would be reviewed under racial discrimination charges. Footage after footage was presented, from his contemptuous words in the meeting to the aggressive shove against Miriam, all replayed like a public indictment. Briggs sat in the interrogation room, face tight, eyes darting. His clumsy answers only worsened his case, because in the court of public opinion, no excuse could cover the truth so clearly laid bare. The press called him the man who degraded human dignity, while activist groups viewed his investigation as the first step toward justice. Inside Richard's company, chaos took hold. Previously silent employees began speaking up, many recounting unfair treatment or witnessing co-workers fired for pushing back. Their stories piled up, collected by reporters and exposed to the public. Each account struck another blow to the image of a successful businessman that Richard had carefully crafted. Shareholders ran out of patience and issued an ultimatum demanding his resignation to avoid dragging the whole corporation down with him. Richard sat alone in his luxurious office, staring out the wide glass window. The sky was a heavy gray. The city bustled below, but to him, everything felt like it was crumbling. The leaked documents, the hearing, the cries for justice outside had merged into a verdict he couldn't escape. Once confident that money could bury any mistake, Richard was left with nothing but isolation and shame. Outside, the public still shouted for accountability, seeing his downfall as a warning to the powerful who had long forgotten the real value of human dignity. As the leaks continued to fuel public fury, the shareholders' final patience ran out. Emergency closed-door meetings were held one after another, no longer about strategy or contracts, but focused solely on one question: how to cut ties with Richard Halden before the company sank with him. Major investment firms that had once backed him without question began announcing withdrawals, a cold, decisive move, as if abandoning a sinking ship. The glaring red numbers on the stock market's electronic boards were the clearest sign. Share prices plummeted without breaks, triggering panic across the financial sector. Analysts on television commented that the mass withdrawal of capital was not just a warning, but the final punctuation mark ending the career of a CEO once hailed as a symbol of success. Richard went all in, calling every major shareholder, promising a plan to restore his credibility. But on the other end of the line, there was only cold silence or a curt reply: "We no longer trust you." Doors that were once wide open now slammed shut all at once, leaving him flailing in a void. The betrayal hadn't come from outside competitors, but from those who once elevated him to the top, and that made the fall even more painful. Shareholders no longer saw Richard as a valuable asset, but as a liability to be removed in order to save what remained. In the emergency board meeting, tension hung heavy in the air. Richard walked in wearing his familiar black suit, but the power was gone. On the table lay stacks of documents detailing losses, scandals, and proof of employee benefit cuts. One by one, board members voiced their reason, calm but ice cold. One said, "We can no longer associate our names with yours." Another added, "The company needs a fresh start." No one mentioned the years Richard had led the company to the top, because those had been overshadowed by the chaos of recent days. When the official announcement was delivered, Richard sat motionless, his chair supporting a body worn down. He was stripped of the CEO title, no longer held any power in the company he had built. In front of the board, he tried to remain composed, but his face flushed, sweat gathered at his temples, and his eyes stared blankly, grasping for something to hold on to. Outside, reporters quickly picked up the news, and headlines like, "Richard Halden loses CEO seat in disgrace dominated every outlet. Photos of him leaving the building, surrounded by flashing cameras and sharp questions, etched the image of a man brought down with no chance to recover. The public took grim satisfaction in watching a man who once sat at the peak of power now become a symbol of failure. They recalled the insult he had hurled at Miriam, now placed beside the image of him lowering his head as he exited the building. Proof of justice turning full circle. For many, Richard's removal was not just personal punishment, but a declaration that even in this world there are lines power cannot cross. And in that humiliating end, Richard realized it wasn't a failed business deal that brought him down. It was the arrogance that had cost him everyone's trust. The downfall of Richard Halden did not close the story as many once believed. On the contrary, it was like the first stone dropped onto a still lake, stirring widening ripples and igniting a wave of intense scrutiny, not just toward him personally, but toward the entire system that had nurtured, shielded, and sustained his power for so many years. Within less than 2 days after the hearing, a slew of international media outlets published in-depth analyses, no longer focusing on individual misconduct, but instead shifting attention to how the company Richard led had allowed, and even encouraged, oppressive behaviors to persist. Long editorials, printed on the front pages of the world's most reputable newspapers, asserted this was not a professional mishap or personal failing, but the exposure of a power structure rotten to the core. A major newspaper in London wrote, "If there hadn't been an internal culture that allowed prejudice to thrive, Richard Halden would never have dared to publicly humiliate an employee right in the middle of an international boardroom." A French commentator emphasized, "No one can act cruelly alone. To belittle others without fear of consequences, one must know they are protected by a closed system." These words were widely shared and translated into multiple languages, becoming an undeniable wake-up call. Human rights experts from several countries spoke out, stressing that the real danger was not in a single derogatory remark, but in the existence of an entire mechanism designed to ensure such remarks would never be punished. What began as an isolated incident quickly escalated into a global issue. On social media, hashtags related to the incident and to the name Miriam Cole reached tens of millions of mentions. The image of that fateful meeting, the video of Miriam removing her golden gloves to sign directly in the face of her former boss, became a symbol of defiance. But this time, instead of focusing solely on her, public attention shifted toward her former company, a place once praised as a model of the modern office, now viewed with deep suspicion. Just a few days later, the hidden stories within that organization began to surface. A wave of former and current employees decided to speak up. They were no longer afraid because they had seen Miriam rise and remain standing. One technician recounted witnessing a black colleague being yelled at and assigned twice the workload of others, simply because he was deemed not refined enough for the main project group. When the technician tried to report it, his manager warned him to watch himself if he wanted to stay employed. A female employee shared that she was excluded from a string of important meetings after complaining about being insulted for coming from a rural area. When she approached human resources, all she received was a shake of the head and the message, "Learn to stay quiet if you want to laugh." These accounts, once suppressed, were now printed in the press, line by line, detail by detail, adding pieces to the dark mosaic that Richard and his executive team had long concealed beneath polished language and a glossy exterior. The media no longer simply reported the news. They joined the investigation. Major newspapers assigned special investigative reporters to search for evidence, reach out to former employees, and cross-reference internal documents. The National Investigative Agency stepped in, forming a special task force to thoroughly examine violations of labor rights and discrimination within the company. It did not take long for them to uncover forgotten documents, unprocessed complaints, ignored reports, memos revealing that whistleblowers had been labeled as difficult to work with. A former department head, speaking anonymously, testified that he had once been instructed to keep internal talk quiet, don't let petty issues affect the company's image. That seemingly harmless line, when recalled, became a confession to a system built on fear and forced silence. The company's reputation collapsed. Within 2 weeks, a wave of partners announced suspended collaborations and demanded internal ethics audits. Conferences and events once sponsored by the company withdrew their name. Economic analysts called it one of the biggest reputation meltdowns of the decade. On television, hosts openly stated, "This is not just one man's fall, but the complete collapse of a fake moral model." Public sentiment echoed this by sharing news clips with blunt captions. Miriam was just the first to speak up. How many others were forced to stay silent? That question echoed everywhere. In cafes, in other companies' boardrooms, on digital billboards where ads once dominated. The media spotlight shifted focus, no longer chasing CEOs and financial indicators, but illuminating those who had once been pushed aside. Miriam, amid the storm, was no longer the center of the story, but she did not disappear. In a small waiting room after the hearing, she sat silently, hands clasped on her lap. Her face was free of elaborate makeup, and the white lighting cast a still, quiet tone over the room. Yet Miriam's eyes burned with an unusual brightness. Not the light of triumph, but the gaze of someone who understood exactly what was happening. She knew the story was no longer about her. Everything had moved beyond personal insults. This had become a sweeping reckoning about how society assigns value to people, about who gets heard and who is forced to remain silent. When the International Human Rights Council officially spoke out, holding a press conference watched by millions, no one called it the Miriam Cole incident anymore. At the podium, the spokesperson gripped the microphone, speaking slowly, each word cutting through indifference. "This is clear evidence of class injustice." That line instantly became the headline of countless news reports. The international media no longer treated the matter as a labor relations mishap, but as a sharp cross-section of modern society, where prejudice ranks people by profession, skin color, background, and status. For the first time in many years, the concept of class injustice stepped out of academic conferences and became a hot topic on social media, in talk shows, and in internal meetings at hundreds of companies. A talk show host asked, "If Miriam hadn't interpreted Chinese that day, would we have ever known what was really going on?" And viewers stayed silent, then nodded, then shared the moment. The Human Rights Council representative's speech was clipped into short segments and spread across TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram like new slogans for the modern generation. Fairness is not a privilege. Silence is no longer an option. Truth cannot be wiped away with money. An image of Miriam in the waiting room, silent, but with eyes still burning bright, was captured by a reporter by chance. There were no studio lights, no media team staging the scene. Yet that photo, with the caption, "She said nothing, but her eyes said everything," became a symbol. It was printed on magazine covers. Human rights organizations used it in new campaigns. It appeared on city walls, on t-shirts, in marches, as a reminder that true strength does not need to shout, only to stand firm. Richard Halden, from his place in hiding, was forced to witness it all. Every time Miriam's photo appeared, he was reminded that the power he once held had vanished without a sound. No one mentioned the investments he had built. No one asked about business strategy. All they remembered was the moment he mocked a woman in a janitor's uniform, and that very moment struck the final blow to the legacy he had spent years constructing. Briggs, now under constant interrogation, could not avoid seeing that image plastered across newspapers. For him, that photograph was a mirror reflecting decline, a truth that no excuse could erase. In the small room, at the heart of the media storm, Miriam did not need to stand at a podium or face the glare of television cameras. Yet she remained at the center, not because she had created the storm, but because she was the first to stand tall inside it. Her gaze, calm and piercing, was the answer to the Human Rights Council's declaration. It needed no grand words. It only needed to exist, to remind the world that from injustice, if someone dares to hold their dignity, justice is no longer out of reach. As the hearing closed in the fading light of late afternoon, the atmosphere outside the hall remained tense like a taut wire. Dozens of reporters jostled behind security barriers, arms raised with recorders, lenses sweeping along the stream of people exiting. Flashbulbs popped like bursts of lightning, aimed at the exit where the names now chased by public attention were expected to appear. Shouts and rapid-fire questions about the Briggs Company, about Richard Halden's scandal, about reactions from international organizations. All of it blended into a chaotic, high-pressure noise. In the middle of that storm, Miriam Cole stepped out quietly, not in a rush, not avoiding anyone, simply walking straight like everyone else. And in that moment, it was her silence that drew attention. A young reporter, not a familiar face in the press circle, unexpectedly spoke up, not loudly, but with firm clarity. "What do you want after all of this?" A question that seemed simple, yet made the entire crowd freeze. For a second, camera shutters paused. The air compressed as the crowd held its breath, waiting for an answer that might headline the evening news. Everyone assumed Miriam would mention compensation, a role backed by NGOs, or at the very least, a symbolic call for reform. But she chose none of those. She turned, eyes looking straight into the lens in front of her, her gaze clear and calm like a still lake, and she said only one sentence, short, without raising her voice, without embellishment, "Just want to be treated with basic human respect." That sentence fell softly like a leaf, yet rang out like a midnight bell, making everything around fall silent. No one laughed. No one followed up. There was nothing more to ask. The answer was already complete. Not a word wasted. Not a thought missing. Its simplicity made it undeniably whole. And as if the entire world exhaled after a suspended second, flashbulbs flared again. But this time, not to chase a headline, but as if to capture a moment that might one day become history. Just hours later, Miriam's words began appearing on the front pages of major news outlets. "Just want to be treated with basic human respect" was quickly clipped into headline, highlighted as the central quote in newscasts. On social media, her image, with a gentle smile and a bright gaze, was shared millions of times, paired with that line like a declaration. No flowery words needed, no dramatic calls required. Its plainness carried its power. A veteran journalist observed, "We've talked endlessly about reform, policy, legislation, but sometimes what we need most is a reminder that people deserve to be treated like people." Miriam's words instantly moved beyond the bounds of a hearing, becoming the core message of an entire movement to reclaim forgotten dignity. In major cities, from New York to Johannesburg, from Tokyo to São Paulo, that sentence was printed on posters and raised during peaceful protests. Pinned posts on thousands of personal accounts all quoted Miriam's word, turning her, a woman once forgotten inside the machinery of a massive corporation, into a symbol of decency, once seen as simple, but long neglected. In schools, teachers told her story to teach students about respect and courage. In corporate meetings, speakers quoted her to challenge leadership on how they treated their employees. That plain line became a red thread, connecting millions who had once been looked down upon, dismissed or mocked because of their background, their status, or their appearance. In the small room where Miriam returned after the chaos, her phone rang non-stop. Her inbox overflowed with messages. People sent her thanks, encouragement, and stories they had never dared to share with anyone. A single mother wrote, "My boss once called me useless, a burden, but because of you, I feel I can stand tall." A migrant worker messaged, "I don't speak well, but your words made me cry, because that's been my life's dream." Someone sent a drawing their daughter had made of Miriam, with the quote scrawled in colored marker below. Miriam read every line, her heart swelling with warmth and a tight, aching emotion. She didn't know how many hearts, how many lives she had touched, just by being true. Meanwhile, the media continued to dissect the meaning of her word. Sociologists pointed out that this was not merely a personal response, but the voice of a vast class. Nameless workers pushed to the margins despite their equal contributions. They spoke of nurses undervalued because they didn't have prestigious degrees, of cleaners who worked quietly through the night, of aging security guards bowing to rude customers. A television commentator said, "Miriam asked for nothing lofty. She asked for what should have been a given, respect. And because it was so basic that no one had bothered to mention it, when it was finally said aloud, it hit harder than any slogan." Elsewhere, inside a villa cut off from the public eye, Richard Halden watched the broadcast of the hearing. He sat alone, soft light falling on a once-pressed suit now wrinkled. When he heard Miriam's answer, he forced a smile. But in his eyes was a bitterness he could not hide. He had expected Miriam to demand something grand, benefits, a board seat, or a massive payout, so he could label her greedy. But no, she had asked for what anyone deserved. And that very simplicity exposed the cruelty he had once seen as normal in the business world. To him, it was a slap, quiet but deep to the bone. Briggs, the one who had told Miriam she wasn't qualified, could not escape the sting of shame either. A single sentence from the woman he had once dismissed had now turned all his actions into living proof of indifference, of a system that had crushed human dignity. But Miriam did not rise as a hero. She didn't go online to call for protests. There was no media campaign behind her. She never claimed to be a symbol, never asked to be celebrated. She was simply a woman who spoke what she believed to be right. And it was that honesty that allowed others to see part of themselves in her words. That sentence became a global slogan not because it was promoted, but because it expressed what millions had thought, had longed for, but no one had spoken at the right moment. As the flashbulbs faded, Miriam quietly left the hall. No lingering, no looking back. But the strength of what she had said continued to spread, like a steady flame keeping alive the hope for lasting change. Even in urban centers, digital billboards in the heart of traffic-heavy cities displayed her words as a reminder in the middle of daily chaos. International magazines used the quote to lead their cover stories. Some publishers even reached out for permission to include it in textbooks. A street artist painted her portrait on an old brick wall in Paris. Beneath it the line, "Being respected is not a privilege, it is a right." And so, although Miriam never called for anything more than something simple, she became the most mentioned person of the week. People began calling her the woman of the simple sentence. not to label her, but to honor the genuine power that comes from courage. By contrast, Richard Halden disappeared from all media platforms. After being removed from his position, he chose to retreat without a statement, without a rebuttal. Newspapers that once praised him now cited him as a textbook example of arrogance leading to downfall. He was no longer invited to conferences, no longer mentioned in financial columns in any positive light. A young reporter wrote, "He once stood at the peak of power, but a simple sentence brought his entire career down like a sandcastle." The contrast between Miriam and Richard became a long-running topic for the press and society. On one side was an ordinary woman, without power, without political backing, shaking the system with one honest sentence. On the other hand, was a former CEO who once manipulated the media, once decided others' futures, but in the end was defeated by truth itself. The balance was clear. Miriam's silence spoke louder than any scream, while Richard's voice now echoed only in the void left by broken trust. And so, with no PR campaign, no scripted speech, Miriam's simple sentence lived on, as a reminder that dignity doesn't need to be polished, only recognized. After days swept up in the whirlwind of media coverage and hearings stretched across headlines and news feeds, Miriam Cole thought she would need a long break, to breathe, to regain balance after a chain of events that seemed never-ending. But life, in its unpredictable way, knocked on her door once more. Not with another crisis, but with an opportunity. On a quiet autumn morning, just as Miriam finished brewing a pot of tea and soft sunlight filtered through the window, an email arrived that made her free. It wasn't a polite networking invitation, nor the kind of, "we will review your application" notice she had grown used to. It was an official offer from a prestigious international corporation expanding into the Asian market. They weren't just seeking a translator, but someone who could stand steady under pressure. Someone with the intuition to hear not just words, but the deeper layers behind them. Someone with the composure proven in the eye of a storm. And the name they chose was Miriam Cole. She read every line, every word steeped in respect and formality, and her heart fell silent. Throughout her previously unremarkable career, Miriam had received hundreds of rejection emails, heard dozens of "not the right fit for this role" from people who had never even met her. But this letter was different. It wasn't born of pity. It wasn't a product of a viral moment. This letter said, "We see you, and we need what you bring." Miriam leaned back in her chair, a wave of emotion rising. She didn't cry, but her eyes welled up. Years of quiet effort, of living under the shadow of bias and dismissal, had finally led to something undeniable, a real recognition, from a world that had once slammed its doors in her face. On her first day at the new office, Miriam wore a simple dark blue suit, nothing extravagant but meticulous in every detail. The elevator took her to the top floor of a modern building, where natural light was carefully designed to flood every corner, and abstract paintings lined the hallway as a statement of global taste. She passed through glass doors into a large conference room, a familiar space, but no longer the one where she once bent down to wipe spilled coffee. The long table was covered in dark wood, glossy black leather chairs arranged neatly, white lights reflecting off the surface in a soft, solemn glow. No one looked at her like she didn't belong. There were no skeptical glances, no raised eyebrows that had once carved themselves into her memory. The people in the room, senior representatives from branches around the world, all stood to shake her hand, offering polite but sincere smile. They didn't know her full past, but they knew one thing. Miriam Cole hadn't walked in on a favor. She was here because she had earned it. Her chair, a leather swivel seat positioned near the lead coordinator, was a symbol. That very spot, years ago, was where she had once bent down to wipe away spilled water without a single word of thanks. That position had once marked the invisible boundary between the ones who had a voice and the ones who didn't exist. Now she was not only present, she was being heard. Miriam sat down, quietly taking a deep breath. In that brief moment, memories flashed through her mind. The times she was asked to clean the meeting room in a rush just before executives arrived, when she had to stay out of sight to avoid disrupting the view of the higher-ups. The times she was called out sharply with no "please." The first time she applied for a transfer and was met with a shake of the head and the words, "What do you know about international negotiations?" None of those moments needed revenge now, because nothing stings more than realizing you once misjudged a person. The meeting began. A representative from Beijing spoke first, voice warm but firm, showing the practiced sharpness of a seasoned professional. Miriam listened closely, her mind operating like a machine finely tuned from years of silent observation. But what set her apart was not just the ability to translate every word accurately. It was the way she understood the layers beneath. What was polite diplomacy? What was a subtle warning? What was a test of intent? When she began interpreting in English, her voice was clear, sharp, and every word deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone realized that sitting before them was not just a translator. She was a bridge, someone who grasped the nuance of language, but also sharp enough to make every exchange efficient. After her interpretation, a regional director turned to a colleague and said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear, "No one can replace her." And that was enough. No other compliment was needed. That one sentence erased all the years of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed simply because of how she looked or where she came from. Miriam gave a slight nod, holding the smile within. It wasn't pride, it was calm, knowing that at last she was seen the right way. News of Miriam's career breakthrough spread quickly. Not the viral kind from earlier videos, but a positive ripple. Articles about her journey of rising into a new role. Analyses calling her living proof that ability rises above bias. The phrase, from janitor to international interpreter, appeared widely across career forums. Not to sensationalize, but to inspire. But unlike before, when people spoke of Miriam with curiosity or pity, this time, it was admiration. Her story became a symbol of a simple truth. A person's worth isn't found in their title, not in the uniform they wear, but in how they live, how they work, and how they keep proving themselves, even when no one's watching. In the building where she was once fired, the name Miriam Cole now echoed like a slap across the arrogance that used to reign there. The people who once whispered as she carried buckets of water now fell silent whenever her name came up. Some avoided eye contact, others pretended not to remember. The cafe on the ground floor, where someone once laughed out loud as she was escorted out, now buzzed quietly. She's sitting in the center seat. No one could deny anymore what they had once deliberately overlooked, that Miriam was never lacking in ability, only in the chance to be seen fairly. At a rare press conference, a reporter asked what she thought of those who had belittled her, looked down on her. Miriam simply smiled. It wasn't bitter, it wasn't triumphant. She said softly, "I'm not waiting for anyone to apologize. I don't need the past to be rewritten. For me, the bowed heads and silence are enough." The answer was not dramatic, not boastful, but for that very reason, it carried weight. In a world where everyone wants to speak, Miriam chose another way, to prove herself through action, not words. She didn't defeat anyone. She only overcame herself. And that kind of victory, needing no applause, was strong enough to force anyone to reconsider how they once saw others. In offices, factories, shops, where people work quietly every day, Miriam's story spread like a ray of hope. Not because they hoped to become famous like her, but because they saw in Miriam something real. Someone who had been underestimated, dismissed, told, "That's all you'll ever be," but didn't give up. She didn't scream for rights, didn't fight with outrage, but with a persistence no one had ever noticed. A new colleague said Miriam often arrived 30 minutes before every meeting to check the interpretation equipment, review technical terms, and even practice her voice to keep it clear, avoid misplacing emphasis. No one saw her post selfies. No one saw her make emotional speeches online. But everyone saw that when she started interpreting, the room went quiet, because they knew every word she said carried weight. No show, no performance, only precision and care. Just like that first time, in the old room, when she removed her yellow gloves and stood to speak to her boss, Miriam didn't speak to be noticed. She spoke because she couldn't stay silent. Now, in her new role, she kept that same spirit. She didn't turn herself into a brand, nor did she share her hardship to win sympathy. She simply did her job, the role of a bridge, between language and understanding, between trust and hurt, between a deeply divided world and the human need to be acknowledged. She, once looked at with pity, was now the one making those eyes look down. But Miriam held no grudge. She moved through it all with unusual calm. In a loud world where everyone wants to be seen, she chose to let her actions speak. And that quiet strength did something unexpected. It made people admire her without her asking for it. Among the hundreds of stories that flash by each day, Miriam's remained. Not because it was too strange, but because it was too real. And in a world where dignity is sometimes sold cheaply, she was the reminder that it can be trampled, but when finally seen, it can still light up even the darkest corners shaped by prejudice. The image of Miriam Cole seated at the center of an international conference room quickly became a symbol of inspiration across many communities, especially among young people of color. In schools, students passed around posters printed with her simple quote, "Just want to be respected as a human being." Teachers used her story to encourage students to confidently pursue knowledge, even when their backgrounds exposed them to prejudice. Many university students shared that they found in Miriam a powerful reminder. Success doesn't always begin from a place of privilege, but sometimes from the humblest steps. A student group in Boston created a forum called Learning from Miriam, where young people shared stories of being dismissed and how they stood up for themselves. The posts and short videos shared there attracted tens of thousands of views, turning it into a space of solidarity for those who once felt invisible. Within the working-class community, Miriam's impact was even greater. Janitors, service staff, and manual laborers who had long been treated as invisible now felt their voices were finally being heard. In break rooms, they posted the phrase, "Respect workers," as a daily reminder. A middle-aged security guard said during an interview, "When I look at Miriam, I feel pride. We don't need to be heroes. We just want to be seen with respect." The movement quickly spread beyond the U.S., reaching Europe and Africa, where migrant workers hung banners demanding equal rights. The simplicity of the message made it widely relatable. Everyone could connect with it, and everyone could see themselves in it. The press continued to analyze the movement's momentum. A major newspaper in the UK ran the headline, "From one meeting room, respect workers becomes a global slogan." The article emphasized that even in modern affluent society, a massive portion of the population still lives in the shadows. Miriam wasn't the first to be demeaned, but her story became the spark freed long-buried voices. On television programs, social activists said the movement not only made workers feel protected, but also forced communities to re-examine how they treat one another. Universities organized forums, inviting Miriam as an honorary guest speaker. At her first appearance in a large lecture hall, thousands of students filled the room, listening intently as she shared her journey. Miriam didn't use lofty language. She spoke sincerely about her years of study, the decision to leave school to care for her mother, and the time spent working quietly in the background. When she said, "Knowledge is the one thing no one can take away," the entire auditorium erupted in applause. Many students later shared that they left the event feeling empowered, believing they too could push past prejudice and pursue the paths they had chosen. In major cities, peaceful marches called Respect Workers were organized. Participants included not only laborers and migrant workers, but also students, intellectuals, and business people wanting to show a shift in mindset. They carried images of Miriam, handwritten slogans, and chanted demands for fairness. The movement wasn't aimed at tearing anyone down, but at a simple goal: creating a society where every profession is treated with respect. Its growing reach drew the attention of politicians, many of whom began mentioning labor rights in speeches, framing it as a priority to gain public support. Miriam remained as composed as ever, never claiming to be a leader or a symbol, yet the social impact of her story clearly exceeded all expectations. From the averted eyes of those who once mocked her, to the chants of students and workers, every sign pointed to one truth: a small act can shift the consciousness of an entire community. And when the words "Respect Workers" appeared across city streets, Miriam knew her path, though it began in humiliation, had led to something greater, turning dignity into a guiding light for society. The influence of Miriam Cole's story didn't stop at viral slogans or peaceful marches. As the Respect Workers movement spread worldwide, major corporations were forced to re-evaluate their internal policy. Many companies that had long ignored internal injustices were now under intense public scrutiny. Reports on employee benefits, wages, and working conditions were demanded to be made transparent. Multinational firms that once prided themselves on professionalism now had to face a pressing question: had they truly respected their work? A leading supermarket chain announced it would raise base pay for part-time staff and pledged to eliminate disparities between office and service workers. An airline updated its policies to ensure that janitorial and ground staff would receive healthcare and vacation benefits equal to those of pilots and flight attendants. Every announced change came with the explanation: "We can't let another Miriam go unseen and disrespected." The media continued to report on this wave of reform. Articles analyzed how, once the public had witnessed injustice, they would no longer accept shallow excuses. Any company that failed to act was instantly compared to Miriam's story and seen as lagging behind. Major investors felt the impact too, applying pressure on corporate boards to make changes in order to protect brand image. Within just a few months, a slew of new HR policies were introduced, ranging from improved training programs for lower-tier employees to the creation of internal feedback channels to ensure every voice could be heard. Academics began calling it the Miriam Cole effect. Universities released studies showing that when a specific story resonates emotionally, it can drive reform more powerfully than years-long legal campaigns. At the International Labor Conference in Geneva, representatives from various countries cited Miriam's example to demonstrate that justice does not come solely from legislation, but also from how society values even the smallest contribution. Changes in HR policy, once considered distant ideals, have now become an inevitable trend to retain workers and maintain global credibility. While corporate systems struggle struggled under the pressure to change. Miriam remained as composed as ever. She rarely appeared in the media, never assumed leadership of the movement, yet her name became inseparable from the transformation of an entire society. International outlets began calling her by a new title, the Janitor Who Spoke Justice. That name quickly spread, not just as a reminder of the moment she saved a meeting with her Chinese translation, but as proof that her action had ignited a voice for justice far beyond language. People saw in her image a beautiful paradox. A janitor, a role often seen as lowly, had become the voice of dignity for millions. The title appeared everywhere, from newspaper headlines to keynote addresses. At a global human rights conference, the host introduced her with the words, "Please welcome, the janitor who spoke justice." The room erupted in applause, many rising to show respect. Miriam simply nodded, her eyes calm, never calling herself a hero, but that humility only deepened the admiration. Students carried handmade signs bearing the phrase during marches, treating it as a symbol of a power shift. Murals across several cities depicted Miriam with her yellow gloves and resolute gaze. Beneath the words, "The Janitor Who Spoke Justice." What made the title unique was that it didn't confine her to the past, but opened a path forward. Social organizations invited her to speak, not as a victim, but as living proof that even the quietest voices can challenge system. In a rare interview, Miriam simply smiled and said, "If my story helps one person stand a little taller, that's enough." That simplicity gave The Janitor Who Spoke Justice even more weight, because it was tied to someone who never sought the spotlight, only stood up for a belief in human dignity. Miriam's social impact didn't fade like a passing trend, but marked a turning point, forced corporations to rethink their operations and communities to reevaluate the true value of labor. And while international summits and global conferences continued to refer to her by her new title, Miriam quietly lived and worked on, letting the truth and justice she once spoke continue to spread. People believed that from now on, no CEO, no security guard could forget the image of a janitor who made the world stop and listen to a simple but resounding message: respect for human beings. After the name, The Janitor Who Spoke Justice, echoed everywhere, many universities began formally inviting Miriam Cole to speak with students. These were no longer quick interviews or media conferences. This time, lecture halls wanted to hear directly from her about the value of knowledge and justice. The first talk took place at a prestigious university in New York. The auditorium was packed, students scrambling for seats, and faculty attending in full as if witnessing a historic event. Miriam stepped up to the podium with her usual composure, carrying no long speech, just a small notebook, yet the room fell into a respectful silence the moment she began speaking. She opened with a simple sentence. "Language once opened a door for me, and it was language that helped me stand tall when I was pushed aside." That line immediately struck a chord with the audience. Miriam shared that language learning didn't just teach her to understand unfamiliar words, but also how to listen and respect diversity. During her silent years of work, she kept reading newspapers and listening to Chinese programs to keep her mind sharp, because she believed knowledge was the only asset that couldn't be stolen. Students listened intently, many taking notes, not out of fear of forgetting facts, but to preserve the power of her lived experience. A linguistics professor later remarked that Miriam's talk was more valuable than any textbook, because it proved that knowledge only becomes truly alive when tied to human dignity. From that talk, other universities quickly extended invitations. Miriam became a guest speaker in many courses, not to offer hollow inspiration, but to remind students that social justice is deeply connected to how we see one another. In every session, she emphasized that language is a tool for connection, but without respect, it can become a weapon of division. After one of her talks, a black student broke into tears, admitting he had once believed his knowledge meant nothing in a prejudiced environment, but now felt confident that with persistence, knowledge would find its way to recognition. Miriam's story didn't stop at speeches. Several universities decided to include her experience in official curricula, not as a media anecdote, but as part of lessons on language and social justice. Students studied the historic meeting in detail, analyzing how Miriam used Chinese to break barriers and simultaneously tip the power dynamic. Alongside that, annotations highlighted that this moment was not a miracle, but the result of steady learning and unshakable resolve under pressure. Many scholars praised the inclusion as a significant step forward, helping students understand that knowledge is never separate from the social context. In classrooms, professors often play the clip of Miriam interpreting before the board of executives for students to analyze the language. They point out the accuracy of her phrasing, the calmness in her tone, and then compare it to the scene where she was once humiliated to clearly reveal the power of reversal. reversal. This exercise doesn't just help students learn language, but also teaches them to recognize injustice and speak up when needed. One sociology student wrote in a thesis, "Miriam helped me understand that language is not just a skill, but a tool to assert dignity and defend justice." Professors call this a socially conscious language lesson because it helps students realize that knowledge doesn't live in an ivory tower. It is rooted in real life. Miriam becomes a living example that a person, even at the lowest position in the labor system, can still use knowledge to shift the balance. High school students also begin hearing her story during extracurricular session, where teachers explain that every new language learned is an opportunity to expand one's world, and that fairness always begins with mutual understanding. For Miriam, being taught as part of a university curriculum is unfamiliar, but she accepts it with humility. She once said in an interview, "If a page written about me helps one student believe they deserve respect, that's enough." That quiet simplicity only adds to her distinct presence, not as a romanticized figure, but as living proof that knowledge, justice, and dignity can reside in an ordinary person. And so, from a meeting filled with humiliation, Miriam's story found its way into textbooks, becoming official knowledge for the next generation. When students turn those pages, they'll see the image of an ordinary woman standing in a boardroom and understand that language does more than convey meaning. It can carry justice. This, more than anything, is Miriam's most enduring legacy, a language lesson tied to human dignity, etched into the memory of an entire generation. When Miriam Cole's story was officially added to the curriculum, many professors chose her as a living illustration of the message, "Knowledge doesn't see uniforms." That phrase quickly spread through academic circles, becoming a topic at conferences big and small. Students read it as a reminder that knowledge doesn't depend on what coat you wear or the title you hold. It lives in determination and the hunger to learn. In classrooms, professors write the phrase on the board to remind students that both janitors and CEOs can carry intelligence and dignity. Education publications noted that the message's simplicity and honesty made it widely embraced. Everyone could see themselves in it, and everyone had to ask how many times they had unknowingly disrespected someone simply because of the uniform they wore. For Miriam, seeing the slogan appear everywhere stirred something deep inside her. She had never imagined that a personal story could inspire others enough to become a guiding principle for an entire generation. In an interview, she said gently, "I just want people to understand that knowledge belongs to everyone, and no one has the right to deny it." Her humility only gave the message more weight because it didn't come from an attempt to create a slogan but from genuine experience. Ordinary workers heard it and felt pride, while academics found a wake-up call. Knowledge does not discriminate, and recognition from the community is the ultimate proof of its worth. As Miriam gradually became a positive symbol, Briggs and Richard were reduced to names associated only with shame. The media no longer referred to them as powerful figures, but as cautionary examples of downfall caused by arrogance and prejudice. Briggs was investigated and forced out of the profession, scowling face in the video, where he shoved Miriam, now used in workshops on racial discrimination, as a warning image. He was cited as proof of how petty authority, when misused, can become cruel. His years of service faded into oblivion, leaving only the memory of a moment in which he humiliated himself before the world. Richard fared no better. After losing his CEO title, he vanished from public events, and the companies that once partnered with him erased his name from their records. When people spoke of him, no one mentioned his past business achievements. They only remembered the image of a billionaire turning pale, desperately seeking help when no interpreter was available. Economic analysts used him as a case study of how power can collapse from a single act of disrespect. A lifetime of honor turned to ashes, and in collective memory, Richard became a shadow of failure, a reminder of how fragile status becomes without humanity. The contrast between Miriam and the two men only sharpened the message. On one side stood the woman once pushed out of the room, now featured in textbooks, her words quoted as simple truths. On the other hand were men who once sat in high places, who once held power and voice, now remembered only in cautionary tale. Time had placed them exactly where they belong. Miriam at the center of respect, Briggs and Richard in a drawer of collective shame. That is what made Knowledge Doesn't See Uniforms not just a lesson to learn, but a reminder of human responsibility toward one another. And so, every time students open their textbooks and see that line, they don't just think of a language lesson, but a life lesson. Miriam had proven that knowledge can shine through any prejudice, while the arrogant, no matter how wealthy or powerful, will eventually fade, leaving only a legacy of shame in the eyes of the public. Miriam Cole's reputation was no longer confined within American borders. From a former employee once cast out of the very building where she worked, her name had now appeared across global human rights forums, becoming a vivid symbol of resilience and dignity. International media called her by many names: the woman of the simple sentence, the symbol of quiet justice, the witness to class reversal, all pointing to one undeniable image: an ordinary human being, with no weapon, no power, who had sparked a global shift. While attention still revolved around the aftermath of previous hearings, Miriam unexpectedly received an invitation from a high-level diplomatic summit, a gathering of leaders from dozens of countries around the world. This was no ordinary event, but a forum for strategic cooperation among major economies, closely tied to human rights, labor, and social transformation. The invitation didn't merely ask her to attend as an honorary guest. The sender, the head of the organizing committee, personally invited her to serve as the official interpreter for several key sessions. It was a role rarely given to someone outside the field, and even more rare for someone without a traditional diplomatic background. But they chose Miriam, and they had no hesitation in stating the reason in the letter. "We need someone who doesn't just say the right words, but carries the right spirit, and you are the only one who can do that." On the day of the summit, the sky above the host city was bright. Flags of more than 30 nations waved atop building, and a red carpet stretched from the security gate all the way to the main entrance. Inside, the hall, spanning thousands of square meters, was prepared in meticulous detail, every element of lighting and sound precisely controlled. Hundreds of delegate seats were labeled by country, each equipped with individual screens and synchronized booth interpretation systems. That space, full of protocol and formality, had witnessed international agreements and historic speeches. And into that solemn setting, Miriam Cole entered, not with her usual quiet anonymity, but under the flash of dozens of cameras trained on her. She wore a dark-colored suit, understated but refined in every line. Her hair was neatly tied, her face free of heavy makeup, but the sharpness in her eyes under the lights was enough to make every camera capture her slightest expression. Miriam calmly walked past the rows of delegates, then sat in the interpreter's seat at the center, a place where the words of heads of state would be conveyed through her voice in 2 languages. Some eyes remained skeptical, some held a cold, assessing gaze, especially from delegates long accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of diplomacy, but her steady presence made them instinctively step back in silence. When the first session began, a delegate from East Asia delivered a speech in Chinese. The entire hall fell silent. Miriam stood up, and the microphone on the desk automatically adjusted to her height. She gave a slight nod, her voice steady, every word precise, articulate, and paced with natural emphasis, as if she had stood in that hall 100 times before. Not a second of hesitation, not a single stumble. Delegates turned to one another, many nodding. Some deliberately jotted her name down on the paper in front of them, a quiet form of acknowledgement beyond protocol. An international journalist seated in the observation area leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "She's not just an interpreter, she's a bridge between 2 worlds, language and dignity." The calm Miriam displayed wasn't just the product of language skill, but a presence shaped by every door she had been pushed out of, every look of disdain she had faced, every time she was told to stay silent when she should have been allowed to speak. Each sentence she interpreted carried a quiet layer of meaning. That understanding is the foundation of all respect. In that hall, where every word held international weight, the fact that someone once dismissed as not qualified was now shaping global dialogue was something no one could deny. The emotional peak came when Mr. Zhang, a veteran businessman from Asia who had once witnessed Miriam's actions months earlier during a chaotic meeting, was unexpectedly invited to speak. He stood up, his expression calm but his eyes clearly holding emotion. Looking directly at her, he spoke in Chinese, his voice slow and deliberate. "We are grateful to you not just for interpreting our words, but for showing the world that respect matters more than any contract." The hall paused. Miriam did not miss a beat, delivering the English interpretation with absolute precision, but everyone in the room understood both versions. The gratitude was not merely a speech, it was a public acknowledgement from a figure of great influence. And when the English version ended, applause broke out. Not the polite, formal kind, real applause. The sound spread like a wave. At first, just a few delegates, then row by row, people rose, chairs scraping the floor as they stood. In seconds, the entire massive hall was on its feet. They weren't waiting for a moderator's cue. No procedure is required for it. They stood because it was genuine, because they knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Bravo!" rang out from the western row, then rippled across the entire chamber. One observer wrote on Twitter, "I've attended hundreds of international summits, but I've never seen every delegate rise to applaud an interpreter." And that moment instantly became breaking news. Miriam bowed her head slightly in thanks, her eyes holding their calm expression. She didn't shed tears, didn't place a hand on her chest in a dramatic gesture. She didn't raise a fist as a symbol of triumph. She simply sat upright, her face quietly radiant. A gentle smile formed at the corners of her lips. Not flashy, but strangely powerful. It was the smile of someone who had once stood in building hallways on night shifts, who had once been shoved out of meetings for wearing an apron, now seated at the center of the world, acknowledged with full solemnity. That smile brought the entire hall to silence. Many later shared that it was that very smile they couldn't forget. A student from Brazil wrote on social media, "I had never cried for someone I didn't know until I saw that smile." Journalists called it the smile of victory, not a victory over enemies, but a victory of dignity over dismissal. Miriam's story was replayed on television hours afterward, not only in major newscasts, but in special features. Millions watched that moment again. The unending applause, the shining smile, and the unembellished face of a woman who had done what no politician had managed to do, made the world pause for a few seconds to remember what matters most: respect. At universities, professors quoted Mr. Zhang's speech to begin their lectures. In office buildings, people started hanging photos of Miriam in meeting rooms beneath the caption, "Respect needs no translation, it reveals itself." An international human rights organization decided to name a new annual award the Miriam Cole Award for Quiet Justice, honoring individuals without power but with extraordinary influence through personal courage. In train stations, airports, and cultural centers, people displayed an image of Miriam standing among the rows of national flags, light falling across her shoulder, with the quote, "Dignity isn't in the uniform you wear, but in how you carry it when it's being stepped on." The summit ended like any other international conference, with joint declarations and signed agreements, but people didn't remember the documents. They remembered the woman who once had no seat at the table, now seated at the center of global decisions. And in the moment when the final applause faded, everyone knew they had witnessed something beyond protocol, a living lesson in endurance, in quiet strength, and in a truth that can't be hidden forever. After all the relentless days, Miriam Cole returned to her small apartment as a way to find her familiar breath again. The room remained simple, with pale-colored walls, a small kitchen corner, and an old wooden table. On a low shelf, she opened a drawer and gently placed inside the worn cleaning cloth that had followed her through the years as a janitor. The cloth was frayed, still bearing faint stains, but to her, it was more than a tool. It was a memory of the days she had been looked down on, dismissed, and the silent sweat she had shed. By placing it in the drawer, Miriam did not intend to erase the past, but to keep it as a reminder of where she once stood and the road she had walked. Outside the window, the city remained noisy with lights and streams of traffic, where people still talked about her story, where the media continued writing new analyses, and where the respect workers movement kept spreading. But Miriam no longer wanted to be part of that whirlwind. She chose instead to return to a normal rhythm of life, brewing herself a cup of hot tea, sitting on her wooden chair, listening to the wind slipping through the cracks of the door. That simple peace, to her, mattered more than any praise, because in the end, what she had longed for was not fame, but the recognition of dignity. And now, she had it. Still, even as Miriam chose a quiet life, the world outside continued to engrave her name. Schools kept teaching the story of the janitor who saved a critical meeting, and human rights conferences still quoted her plain words as proof of the value of knowledge and fairness. On social media, the image of Miriam's calm smile inside the diplomatic hall kept being shared, becoming a symbol of perseverance. People called her by many titles, but perhaps the simplest and most familiar remained the woman who made the world listen to the truth. The legacy Miriam left behind did not lie in speeches or titles, but in the way she turned endurance into strength. The old cleaning cloth in the drawer, the photo of her interpreting with bright eyes, the sentence, "Just want to be respected as a human being," all came together to form a timeless symbol. They served as reminders that justice does not arise from grand gestures, but from steadfastness, in moments that might seem small. That legacy spread everywhere, from university hallways to factories, from sleek offices to working-class neighborhoods, planting in people the belief that anyone can stand tall and be heard. Richard Halden and Briggs slowly faded into oblivion, their names only appearing in lessons about moral failure. In total contrast, Miriam remained in the collective memory as proof that truth can change an entire system. Whenever an employee felt dismissed, they remembered her. Whenever a young person of color felt pushed to the margins, they recalled her story as a source of strength. And so, though Miriam chose to live in peace, she never disappeared from the community's heart. At night, as the city outside remained lively, Miriam gently closed the window, letting the soft yellow light fall across her small room. She smiled, knowing she had walked through the darkest days to find light, not just for herself, but for many others. In her heart, there was no longer resentment, only peace, and a quiet belief that once human dignity is affirmed, it can no longer be buried. And so, from that small apartment, Miriam began writing a new chapter of her life, quiet, full of pride, so that her legacy would continue to echo through the rhythms of the wider world. When Miriam Cole closed the drawer where she kept the old cleaning cloth as a witness to the life she had lived, a simple but unforgettable lesson echoed within her. Dignity cannot be trampled. That sentence was not a slogan crafted to win public favor, but a truth paid for with years of silent endurance and moments of humiliation. It was etched not only into her own memory, but into the minds of millions who had followed her journey. Anyone who has ever felt dismissed find in this story a clear affirmation that human worth does not depend on the seat they occupy, the clothes they wear, or the job they do, but on the enduring dignity within. That lesson gradually became a red thread connecting different generations. In schools, teachers wrote the sentence on the board as a reminder of how to treat others fairly. In social organizations, speakers repeated it as a foundation for every fight for justice. And in everyday life, ordinary workers, from street sweepers to service staff, felt that a light was now shining on their path. Dignity cannot be trampled was no longer just a conclusion from one story, but a compass reminding everyone that respect must never be a privilege reserved for a select few. Miriam's story, therefore, did not end as a closed chapter in history, but as a lingering resonance within society. It required no grand finale, no showy celebration. Its strength lay in its simplicity, just like the way Miriam stepped out of the conference hall, calm amidst the applause of hundreds of international delegates. That lingering echo was a reminder that justice doesn't always come from courts or legal rulings, but can rise from one act of standing tall, one proud smile, or one simple sentence spoken at the right moment. As the world moved forward with new distraction, the legacy Miriam left behind remained steady, like a whisper in the minds of many. It made us ask ourselves how we treat the people around us, how many values we've overlooked just by judging uniforms or job titles. It stirred a belief that a fairer society is not only built by sweeping policies, but begins with the small respect found in each glance, each word. And that very simplicity, when echoed by many, becomes a force strong enough to change an entire system. Miriam's story comes to a close, leaving behind a resonance of justice that is quiet yet powerful. It is not loud or dazzling, but persistent like a heartbeat, making everyone who remembers it pause for a moment. It is the story of a woman once pushed out of a conference room who, through knowledge and resolve, compelled the world to rise and applaud. And in the final light, the only remaining message is the undeniable truth. Once human dignity is affirmed, it becomes the foundation upon which justice exists. As Miriam Cole's journey ends with the image of her sitting in a small apartment, placing the old cleaning cloth into a drawer like a keepsake, many have realized this is not just a series of personal events, but a powerful social epic. From a humiliating beginning in a lavish boardroom to the moment she sat in an international hall receiving applause from global delegates, the arc of Miriam's journey draws a vivid curve of justice. From the shadow of disregard, through the storm of resistance, to the light of respect, that arc forms an unforgettable summary of the value of human dignity and the hidden strength of knowledge. What makes Miriam's story remarkable is not its surprise, but its harsh logic. A wealthy CEO like Richard Halden, who was used to leveraging power to manipulate and conceal, was revealed to be fragile when deprived of a translator. A police officer like Briggs, believing himself in control, exposed his own pettiness when he humiliated a janitor in front of dozens of executives. Both men assumed the system would protect, but that same system, once unmasked, turned its back. Seen in isolation, these were individual events, but pieced together, they reveal a clear truth. False power can never overcome truth. Miriam did not triumph through loud resistance or complex strategy, but through steadfastness and knowledge. That is what lifts her story beyond traditional models of justice. When she stood up, removed her yellow gloves, and spoke fluent Chinese. It was not a spontaneous act, but the result of years of silent study, even while working as a janitor to care for her ailing mother. When Briggs shoved her out the door, her choice to remain upright in silence was not submission, but a declaration that dignity cannot be stripped away. And when she received applause in the International Hall, her calm smile was not for show, proof that a person can rise above all scorn and shine on their own. Looking back on the entire journey, 3 layers of meaning emerge. The first is exposure. The truth about how systems treat the vulnerable has been brought into the light. The clip of Miriam translating Chinese and the clip of Briggs pushing her out of the conference room became undeniable evidence, leading to the downfall of both Richard and Briggs under public pressure. The second layer is reversal. Those who once held power were forced to step down in disgrace, while the person once at the bottom was brought to the center of an international roundtable. The third layer is affirmation. The messages, knowledge does not see uniforms, and dignity cannot be trampled, have become a legacy, rising far beyond a single event to become a standard for how to live. From this, the lessons that inspire viewers come clearly into focus. The first lesson is the power of knowledge. Miriam was once a top student in Chinese language studies, but had to leave school due to family hardship. Still, she never let her knowledge fade. Her quiet persistence in learning became the foundation that helped her stand firm in the most critical moment. This lesson reminds us that knowledge is never wasted, even when life forces us to set aside our dreams. It is a seed, and one day, in the right conditions, it will sprout to protect us. The second lesson is the value of dignity. When Richard called Miriam garbage, he did not just insult an individual, but exposed how society views low-wage workers. Yet Miriam proved that dignity does not come from the job we do, but from how we hold on to self-respect in every situation. Through her calm presence, she helped the world see that contempt, no matter how long it lasts, can never erase a person's true worth. This is a powerful reminder to all that dignity cannot be trampled under any circumstances. The third lesson is the strength of community. Without the employees who recorded the video, without the online community who shared and spread it, Miriam's story might have ended in that meeting room and faded into obscurity. But that very act of sharing turned it into the Respect Workers movement, pushing corporations to change policies, encouraging schools to include the story in curricula, and prompting international human rights councils to speak out. The community proved that when many voices rise together, the truth cannot be buried. The final lesson is that calmness can overcome every storm. Miriam did not fight back with rage or retaliate with extreme actions. She chose to stand firm and let truth and time speak for themselves. That very calmness made her a symbol. Her gentle smile amid international applause was proof that victory doesn't need to be loud, it needs resolve. This too reminds every viewer that in life, sometimes calm is the strongest weapon we have against injustice. As the story comes to a close, what remains is not the image of Richard losing his position or Briggs being investigated, but of Miriam returning to her small apartment, choosing quiet over the glare of media lights. The world outside remains noisy, but she is calm enough now to step away from the chaos. Her legacy does not lie in titles, but in the simple words etched deeply. Knowledge does not see uniforms, and dignity cannot be trampled. These very words made her living proof that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom, but can rise from an ordinary person who dares to stand tall at the most crucial moment. Viewers finishing the story will carry with them a mix of reflections. They may see themselves in the moments Miriam was mocked, or find renewed faith watching her hold her head high. They might recall times they were underestimated and wonder, would I have the same resolve as Miriam? More than anything, they will come to understand that justice is not distant or abstract, but lives in small, genuine acts, when each person dares to respect others as they would themselves. For that reason, the legacy Miriam Cole leaves behind is not just a personal story, but a global reminder. It teaches that knowledge, dignity, and calmness can transform an entire system. It affirms that the community holds the power to protect fairness, and it spreads the belief that anyone, no matter where they stand in society, can become a voice for justice. The story ends, but its echo continues, quiet yet powerful, just like Miriam herself once was, and forever will be.